Okay, it's 4 o'clock, so we'll get started. Before I do anything else, may I remind everyone present, this meeting will be broadcast live via the internet and the record archive for future viewing. At this time, I'd like to welcome Margarita Wright to our planning committee and thank Councillor Lloyd for his contributions in the last year. Also, many members will be aware that former Councillor Val Hartree unfortunately passed away last Thursday. Val was a member of this committee for 15 years prior to leaving the council last May, and I'd just like to ask you to stand for a moment's silence before we get underway with the agenda. Thanks very much. Councillor Hodges.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for that mark of respect for Val. You're quite right, it's a long-standing member of this committee and this council, and an irascible and strong defender of her community, and she certainly knew right from wrong. She will be a great loss to Dinas Powys, and it's right and proper that we remember her here today. So thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to any apologies for absence.
Yeah, Councillor Liz Burnett and Councillor Margaret Wilkinson. Thank you.
I've also been informed by Councillor Eddie Williams he is running late. He anticipates being with us at 4:45, so we can all look forward to that. He's on his way from London, so he turned up in a rush. Yeah, he may not work out he's come in the room. Minutes of the last meeting, item 2. Have someone to move those, please? Moved and seconded. Thank you. If I start round to my left on item 3, any declarations of interest?
Yes, so I'll have to declare an interest on the St Cyrus application. Yeah, and I will be leaving the room. Thank you.
Should you say why he has to leave the room?
Yeah, same reason as you asked me last time, Councillor
Just do it every time.
Johnson. Okay, it's the fact that I live next door to the site.
It's not so much,
Yeah, I'll be declaring on the final planning application. It's 2016-01427. I have a personal and prejudicial interest. I have known John for 40 plus years as a friend and colleague. Sorry, I will be leaving.
Thank you. Any other declarations of interest? Make my way round. Councillor Parker.
Yes, similar on 2016-01427. I have also known Mr. and Mrs. John Thomas and his wife for in excess of 40 years, so I do have a reason for declaring an interest, and I will be leaving the room.
Personal and prejudicial interest. Okay. Councillor Penrose.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I've discussed with the monitoring officer planning application 2016/01427, which is St Athan, and reference being a cabinet member, and obviously the applicant is the leader of the council, cabinet member. However, I'm sure that as I have no interest in the actual application, I will be staying and I will be voting on it.
Thank you very much. I don't have any interest to declare, so move on to item 4, site inspections report from our last meeting. Move and note, thank you. And item 5, this is to accept the nominations for this year's Public Rights of Way subcommittee. Similar item comes up every year. It didn't meet last year. If we could have someone to move that. Thank you. Item 6, building regulations under delegated authority. Move and note, thank you. Item 7, planning applications determined under delegated authority. Someone to move and note that. Thank you. And item 8 is our appeals item. Is Justina going to speak on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Is that on? Yeah. Thank you, Chair. It's a bit of a mixed result with this appeals report. There were a few appeal decisions which related to planning applications mentioned first in the report. 7 Barry Road was the conversion of an existing A1 unit to residential, and the inspector concluded that as this was on the edge of the retail centre, she concluded that their loss to residential wouldn't have an impact upon the vitality and viability of the retail centre itself. She does quote our policy where we look to retain at least a minimum of 50% A1 retail units, and as we were below that, she didn't think that it conflict with that policy, which is a bit disappointing because the 50% is not a target, it's a minimum of the number of retail A1 units that we would like to retain, but she saw that as a reason to, or one of the reasons to grant approval. The second one, Anna Livia, was a decking and balustrade. It's in a special landscape area in City. Again, it was a bit of a disappointing decision because this is on the edge of a very rural piece of landscape, and it was a very domestic, quite modern looking bit of decking and balustrade, but the inspector considered on balance that it was acceptable in the context of the other domestic development that was either side of it. The coach house in Penarth, this is an appeal decision that supported our decision to refuse, and there were a number of items on the planning application, but the two that were of concern was in respect of the proposed cladding and a proposed flue. The cladding was quite a modern amendment in this part of the conservation area, and it wasn't typical of the materials used in this part of the conservation area, so thankfully the inspector supported our decision in that case. And then the last two items are relate to refusal of applications for tree preservation orders. applications for works to trees are subject to tree preservation orders. The first in Broadway in Llanbleddian, the inspector first of all agreed that the trees were of an amenity value and agreed with our decision in respect of them still contributing to the amenity value of the area. However, with regard to the justification, this was a group of trees, one of which she was considered to be in a particularly poor state, and as that tree she found to be dangerous, she approved the removal of all trees as she considered them to share a root plate. So that appeal was allowed. But the second one, again, the inspector agreed that the trees contributed to the amenity value of the area, and considered there to be no justification for the works. That was on the basis of there being no evidence of any structural instability or any impact those trees were having on development near the trees, and so that decision was supported. And that's it in respect of the appeals. Thanks.
Councillor Penrose.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I only had a request, and it's to do with the statistics at the end of the report. As you're aware, some of the appeals come from delegated matters and others come from planning committee. Could we have a differentiation on the report in future that shows the difference in delegated? Because obviously the percentages get affected, so if we separate delegated and committee decisions, it gives a more accurate percentage on what the actual planning committee's decisions and percentage of success rate is. Yeah? That's all right. I don't know if other members have a problem with that. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. That I can certainly do that. I can produce some separate tables for every committee. It is indicated in the summaries that whether the appeals were delegated or committee, but I can certainly produce separate tables. That's no problem.
It might be more useful at the end of the year, looking back in terms of how the committee's performing against the inspector's feelings on appeals. Thank you for that, Councillor Benner. Any other observations on the appeals section? No. Okay. Moving on to our trees, delegated trees list. Want to move that? Move and notes. Thank you. Okay, moving on to item 10, general planning matters. 10.1 is discharge of condition 24, construction traffic management plan, plan permission reference 2017/01136/hybrid, former St Cyrus Lower School, Merch Road in Dinas Palace. Yeah, so if I could ask Victoria to introduce this.
Thank you, Chair. So members will recall it wasn't very long ago we were dealing with the application to approve the hybrid application, which was for residential development and community use on the former St Cyrus site in Dinas Palace. As part of that determination, members of the Planning Committee requested that certain conditions come back to Planning Committee for determination. So the report deals with the condition 24 of the which is the construction traffic management plan, and the report sets out in some detail the proposals that have been put forward for the routes for construction traffic on this site, and including some proposals for alternative routes, which is set out in some detail in the report, and concludes that the plan that's been submitted by the developer is acceptable. The key, I think one of the key issues has been around the access to the site coming along Merch Road and Merch Crescent, which is a road that has residential properties fronting it and has a couple of schools in close proximity. On the junction of Merch Road and Cardiff Road is the Dinas Palace Infant School, and also the Merch Junior School is tucked around the back, but accessed, pedestrian access is from Merch Road. So there was concerns about construction traffic in that vicinity, and for that reason the construction traffic management plan states that those vehicles won't be permitted around the times of school drop-off and pick-up. The Highways Authority have been involved in those discussions and are satisfied with the proposals put forward. Mike's obviously here this evening as well if members do have any questions about the highways technicalities of that.
Sorry, if I could briefly clarify, the display's got nothing to do with this particular application. This is already on the screen ready for a future planning application and doesn't have any bearing on what we're discussing. Sorry, Vicky.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I would also draw members' attention to the matters arising reports. So we've had some submissions from the applicant, Barrett Homes, in respect of this report. As alluded to in the committee report, this application for condition discharge is also an application for condition discharge for other matters. Sorry, I've just lost my page a sec. Which are set out in the reason for the committee determination. So it was conditions 20, which is about a travel plan, 24, the construction traffic management plan, which is set out in this report, and a further conditions 33 to 37 about drainage. All of those matters needed to come back to planning committee for determination. In the meantime, since the publication of this report, the applicants Barretts have written to us, and that letter is in the matters arising notes. And they've also submitted their travel plan in discharge of condition 20, an amended travel plan to deal with the comments from our public transportation section. So we are now happy with the details that have been submitted in discharge of the travel plan condition, and they are attached as in the matters arising papers. So we are amending the recommendation to also agree the details for condition 20, the travel plan, and to further consider the request by Barrett Homes that the last conditions 33 to 37 regarding drainage, that those matters be referred back under officer delegated powers to be determined by officers given their technical nature. And the reasons for doing so are set out in that report, that the applicants are keen to proceed with the development and to get on with it, that the matters are with our drainage engineers for their consideration, and given the technical nature of those details, that it would normally be dealt with by officers under officer delegation. The request is that that delegation is reinstated. Okay.
Thank you. So if I would call forwards my first speaker, Councillor Vince Driscoll, will have 3 minutes to speak as a non-member of the committee because he's withdrawn from the discussion of this. Similar to the last time the application was dealt with, the Standards Committee gave dispensation to allow him to speak for 3 minutes, but not to take part in the debate or vote on it. So if I was introducing the declaration of interest, that's what I would have said at the beginning of the meeting, but there we are. Councillor Driscoll, you have 3 minutes. You can start speaking. The clock will start when you start speaking.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure you're all aware, this is for the traffic construction plan for the St Cyrus site, which is going to house 215 houses. It'll take about 4 years to build. It's a serious number of lorries. Anybody that took the trouble to go and see the site visit will understand how difficult the access is. We have suggested in the past that we come across Glascoed Farm off Sully Road and onto the top of Merch Crescent, which will alleviate a lot of the traffic going up Merch Crescent. The farm is willing to do this. The highways have already put up a couple of objections to it, however, I'm not quite sure the objections stand. One of them is a visual display, and the other is the hardcore of the ground. This entrance is already being used by Barrett's for their car park and their materials site. So it's already being used as an access onto the farm, and then they go across the road to their site, the other side. I'm sure there's other ways around it. We can manoeuvre the track. There's work that can be done, but I'd like you to think carefully about it, because it's a serious inconvenience to the people doing this powers for 4 years. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
If you want to turn your microphone off, please. Questions of clarification? Take your seat, Vince, please.
For clarification from Councillor Driscoll, who's not speaking as a member of this committee, what is he asking this committee to actually do with regards to the proposals in front of it this afternoon?
At the very least, to defer them and to go back to the drawing board on this traffic plan.
Thank you very much. And you're going to leave the chamber now? If there's no other questions or clarification? Nope. Thank you. Our next speaker, apologies. If I ask Mrs. Zoe Aubrey to make their way to seat over there. And your 3 minutes will start when you start speaking.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to point out that, Barratt Homes, we're a responsible organisation. We strive to achieve safe working environments for our construction staff and minimise any disruption for existing residents during the construction phase of developments. In this regard, since the last committee, we have engaged with Vince, Councillor Driscoll, and we've actually undertaken a site visit and walked the alternative routes. And I think what that has identified is that those routes aren't deliverable from a technical, ecological and ownership perspective. Whilst Mr. Driscoll referenced that the landowner is willing to engage in this process, the landowner has confirmed that he would expect to be financially compensated. And, given that there is an alternative route via adopted highway, to defer this matter for further investigation would in effect impose a Grampian condition on Barratt David Wilson Homes with no certainty over the deliverability of the alternative routes. As I'm sure you're aware as committee members from your training, any planning condition has to pass the 6 tests. And in this regard, it would not pass all of those tests because there is no certainty that the condition could be delivered. However, we have a robust construction traffic management plan presented to yourselves tonight, a committee, to approve, which seeks to restrict delivery hours to avoid, conflicts with school movements. And, whilst I appreciate, there's always concerns when, there is an element of change as we move towards construction, it should be put into context that actually, on the average day, it will only equate to 6 vehicles, construction vehicles, leaving and entering the site, which is 1 additional movement in every 100th minute. There will be more intense times when site excavation works take place as we move from one phase to the other, but even then, we're only looking at 3 additional vehicle movements per hour. So, I accept that there are probably concerns from the local community, but I'm sure, so really I urge you to discharge the condition before you tonight and defer the other conditions back to the case officer for decisions due to drainage being a technical issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before you step down, are there any questions of clarification from the committee? No, thank you very much. I'd like to ask Mr. Jose Ferreira, please take your seat. You'll have 3 minutes when you want to start talking. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Jose Ferreira, Engineering Manager with Barratt Homes, David Wilson, South Wales. Following the concern raised by councillors about the proposed route for construction access, we attended the site on Thursday, 12th of April, to walk the alternative routes and to subsequently consider their suitability. The alternative routes are via Sully Road and either Watery Lane or Glasgow Farm. Unfortunately, they have been found to be unsuitable for construction vehicles due to their substandard geometry and substandard structure. Our proposed route for construction traffic therefore remains via Cardiff Road and Merch Road and Merch Crescent. Whilst we understand people's anxiety with this route, the number of movements in terms of heavy construction vehicles is an average of 6 per day entering and leaving the site. There will be occasion, as Zoe has mentioned, where we have to move some soils because there's an element of cartway on the site. And on those occasions, and we estimate that those occasions to be 4 number periods of 1 week, there will be approximately 25 movements per day. Those periods could actually be, they're flexible, so we could actually move those, and we'll seek to put them within less inconvenient time periods. We understand that congestion is an issue at the schools at dropping off and picking up times. All suppliers and contractors will therefore be instructed that no movements will be permitted to or from the site half an hour before and after school start and finishing times. Delivery times will therefore be restricted to between 7:30 and 8:15, 9:30 and 2:40, and 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. on all weekdays of term times. All parking for both workers and visitors will be located within the boundary of the site. Site managers will ensure that there will be no construction, contractor or visitor vehicles parked on the existing highway of Merch Road and Merch Crescent. This will be communicated to all persons by signage and at our site inductions. Our site inductions have to be, every person that works on the site or visits the site has to go through a site induction. In terms of the medical centre, access will be maintained throughout the course of construction programme. All construction vehicles...
Thank you very much, sir. That's your 3 minutes. Has any members got any questions of clarification on what's been said already? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ferreira. There was reference made earlier to a nearby construction site, which I believe is the sort of the other side of Glascoed Road. I'm just wondering if you could explain in a bit more detail as to how it's appropriate for vehicles to reach and work in that environment, but not on the other side on the St. Cyrus.
Sorry, Mr. Councillor Johnson, I don't think that's clarifying anything he's talked about.
Well, yeah,
We've got a highway engineer who can answer the questions on the debate. Clarification.
He said that it wasn't possible to reach that point due to the geography of the site.
The geometry.
The geometry of the site. Sorry.
Okay, it's just because you opened it by referencing the previous speaker. So in relation to what he said, why is
geometry... Why is that not possible when the other one is?
Okay.
The arrangement for parking, where we have an arrangement with a farmer for our development on Sully Road, only involves accessing the farmland from Sully Road. For us to use the farm as a route for our site in St. Cyrus, we would have to traverse the entire width of the farm, which is a much longer distance. And the existing structure of the track on the farm is extremely poor. It's massively potholed, and it would have to actually be either reconstructed before use by heavy construction vehicles, or at least remade after the period of construction. Also, the geometry within the farm, halfway through across the farm, there are farm buildings which are extremely constrained in terms of turning. There's multiple turns to get past those farm buildings, and that is not an issue for the parking arrangement off Sully Road.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions or clarification? Thank you, sir. You can step down. Following on from those speakers, before I open up to the floor, does anybody want to comment? Mike, do you want to make any comment from Highways perspective?
Well, I think I'll probably just wait and see if there's any questions at the moment.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be honest, I'm aware that he has dispensation from the Salmons Committee, but I still find it a bit strange that somebody with sight of the site is here talking as a local councillor. I just find that a little bit odd. I think that as a local member, I'm sure that Councillor Driscoll and others will be aware of, this perhaps is the problem of accepting the LDP and the principle of development on this site before any of the infrastructure that they've requested is put in place. I was interested both by Councillor Driscoll's comments regarding the Sully Road site and the explanation there from Mr. Ferreira. I thought that was very interesting. I have 2 points really which are sort of quite closely related to each other. The first is that we've been given a 40-page document at less than 24 hours notice regarding the revised travel plan. It's dated 1st of June 2018. It was sent to us yesterday afternoon. I don't think that's an appropriate amount of time for committee to be able to read, digest and be able to ensure that any consultation has taken place as should be intended. I would therefore ask that that condition is deferred until the next meeting so the consultation can take place with residents in Dinas Powys regarding the findings of the revised travel plan. As a result of that, I would also suggest at the same time that we consider a deferral of the construction management plan to consider the issues that have been raised by the local members and to reconsider whether any of that is appropriate to be conducted across Glascoed and from Sully Farm, or whether that is entirely impossible to be done. This is a major development. There are relatively few vehicle manoeuvrings. That was confirmed earlier. If there's relatively few vehicle manoeuvrings, then I think you should consider exactly how much work is needed to do that across the farm rather than through the village itself. So I'd like to move a deferral on those two, whilst also happy to move that the issues regarding drainage are returned to the relevant officer for determination. Thank you.
I was going to say, you have a second, I'm sure you would. Any other comments before I move that to a vote then, if there's no other comment? Vicky first.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd just like to address those points really. Firstly, if you don't mind, I'll deal with the CTMP issue, which is the main agenda item and has been explained in some detail in the report as to those options have already been thoroughly considered. Our own highway engineers and Barrett and the local councillors have all been out on site with the landowner, tried to look at all these alternatives and have found that there are none suitable and for very good reasons which have been explained to you and are in the report. So I think deferring to look at those issues again is nothing more than a waste of time for everybody involved. That has been considered thoroughly already and those options have been discounted for very good reason. We must remember that in allocating this site for development, it's in the LDP, in granting planning permission, we were assuming that construction traffic would be going along the adopted highway, as is proposed in the CTMP that's before you that we're recommending approval for. There is no reason in highway safety terms why the vehicles can't use the highway that accesses the site, and that's that is what's being proposed and that is what's considered to be acceptable. So that's it's obviously for members to decide whether or not you feel there is need for even further investigation, although I'm not sure what else can be investigated. On the point of the travel plan, I do take the point that the document has been given to members with 24 hours notice to read through, and it is a long document. My response to that is to say that these documents are normally considered by officers with no consultation. Consultation is undertaken with the relevant internal consultees, which has happened in this case. Officers are considered to be the experts in these areas that are assessing these matters day in, day out. We deal with hundreds of these applications and we have assessed the travel plan fully and are recommending to you that it does what it should do. It meets our requirements for a travel plan. It sets out everything that you would expect to see in a residential travel plan. Barrett's are suggesting that they will have a travel plan coordinator that they're going to employ that is specifically looking at this site and promoting sustainable travel options. Our internal experts have had a look at it and they're perfectly happy with all the proposals set out in it. We wouldn't normally undertake public consultation on condition discharge matters. It's not a requirement, it's not undertaken. So that's why we feel that members should be satisfied that actually officers have assessed this matter and are satisfied that it is an appropriate format for a travel plan. And again, delaying it will just delay it for another month, albeit if members feel very strongly that you want to consider it in more detail, that's entirely up to you, obviously.
Thank you. I've got a few who've indicated they want to speak. First of all, Councillor Eddie Williams. As the Councillor knows, having joined us after we've started the debate, you can speak on it, but you won't be able to vote on it. So well done for getting here earlier than you said. Eddie.
Yeah, I just wanted to record my apologies for arriving late and just explain it just for the public that I can't engage in this because I haven't fully heard all the matters arising.
Thank you. Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chairman. Am I correct? Are we asking for delegation to be reinstated to you, or are we asking for this to be an approval of the condition? Sorry.
So the matters arising recommend that the condition 20 travel plan is capable of being discharged here and now, and secondly that the remaining conditions, the drainage conditions, are with our technical drainage officer and should be determined under delegated powers when he's confirmed that he's happy with the details.
Okay, supplementary from Councillor Parker.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was relating it back to Darren Farm, where the fact that we did ask for delegation to be reinstated, but that it actually the ward member was consulted before, and that worked very successfully on the traffic management plan, because we actually totally changed the traffic management plan and reduced the numbers on it. If that could be done, it might be helpful, but I am content with the experience I had on Darren Farm to support this.
Councillor King.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at the travel plan on page 57 of my report, and it's about the delivery time restrictions. And I'm assuming that's been in some consultation with the schools, and perhaps the local ward members who know when that road is whatever. My only additional, I'm seeking that confirmation, but the only other one I thought about was on waste recycling days, whether we need to be mindful and advise the construction management people that that may not be a good time to arrive.
I'm not aware that, sorry, firstly on the schools issue, yeah, the school opening times are set out in the report and the construction times are arranged around them. I should just say, I did also have a verbal comment about the breakfast club arrangements at the school. So there's quite a few children that will be dropped off in advance of these school times and potentially when there would be construction traffic going to and for. We did get comments from Highways on that issue, and clearly breakfast club arrangements, I'm a parent of small children that go to breakfast club myself, so the arrangements are, you know, it's much more ad hoc. It's you know, parents dropping off at any point over, you know, potentially an hour-long period. You don't get the congestion that you get at proper pick-up and drop-off times. And this construction traffic management plan isn't about attempting to avoid any time when there may be children on the pavements on these roads. It's about trying to avoid the problems that arise around the particularly congested times around school pick-up and drop-off in morning and peak afternoon times. So hopefully that reassures you on the school issues. But in respect of the waste and recycling days, I'm not aware that issue that has been addressed in the CTMP, and certainly there's no time restriction in position around those days. Those days are obviously subject to change, and they are, what, I don't know, a half an hour window perhaps once a week, when it, you know, there's all, well, anyone that's been stuck behind a waste vehicle knows what it's like to experience that. I don't know how reasonable it would be to impose any kind of restriction, bearing in mind the times when those vehicles come and go can change quite significantly in any day. So I don't see how we could really reasonably factor it into a restriction to vehicle time. So I think it's probably a case for the site construction manager to be aware of and to perhaps informally try and work around that.
Thank you. Anybody else wishing to speak? I would like to move, and we will obviously take the first motion first. I would like to move that all of the conditions are delegated, but that 24 and 20, construction management and the traffic plan, are negotiated with local ward members prior to them being discharged. If there's anyone who wants to second me on that, obviously we will. Okay, a few people. I will first move to the first motion. Councillor Johnson's was around deferring 24 and 20 and confirming the delegation of the remaining numbers. All those in favour of that motion? Oh, sorry, Councillor Johnson.
I did just want to point out that this was what was being suggested by the ward member, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. Okay. All those in favour of Councillor Johnson's and Councillor Hodges' motion? All those against? Any abstentions? That motion fails. Before I take the next motion, Vicky wanted to speak on that motion.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to clarify the point on the CTMP because we have already engaged with the ward members in discharge of that condition, and we've got to the point where we as officers are happy with this information. I just want to be clear about what committee's expectation is in terms of further involvement and negotiation with. Sorry, if I can just wait for.
If we could take this opportunity to all turn off our phones. If you leave, you won't be able to vote on the motion. Okay, fine. She won't be voting on the motion.
Sorry, forgive me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't compete with the ringtone. Yeah, I just wanted to be clear what level of consultation is now expected with local ward members, because the Darren Farm one that Councillor Parker referred to, there was unanimous agreement from local ward members and they were satisfied with the CTMP, and therefore officers were comfortable to obviously approve the details. I suspect in this case we may not reach that mutual level of agreement with the local ward members, and therefore I just want to be clear about what delegation is being reinstated to officers.
Councillor Bird.
Chair, I don't know whether it'd be acceptable or not, but I would like to act as maybe an arbitrator, that if I was involved with the local members and we couldn't talk sense into them, we'd have to move it forward within, say, 2 weeks or something like that. I don't know.
Okay, I mean, I move the motion. I think in terms of, there was clearly a point made within the comments from the ward member around an item which wasn't referred to in the report. It has been dealt with on the floor, but there has been a suggestion of additional work, and rather than this come back to the committee, I was seeking to delegate that to officers, and when that issue is bottomed out, as far as I'm concerned, there would be nothing else in the way of it. I mean, clearly there are consultations with officers with ward members around 106 contributions that reach a point where there is a conclusion made. So that would be the status of the delegation as far as the motion, and whoever was chosen as my seconder, if they're happy with that, we'll move on to the motion. Councillor Parker. Okay, there we go. You'll second that abridged motion. All those in favour of the motion as abridged? And against? And that was everybody because Eddie's not voting. We'll discount Councillor Wright's vote from the numbers because of leaving the room. Thank you, Councillor Parker. Okay, that brings that item to a close. Councillor Driscoll back into the room before we move on to the next item. Okay, moving on to item 10.2, phase 2 of the development consisting of 306 new homes, new open public space, landscaping, highways infrastructure, land at Northwest Cowbridge. Vicky.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a slightly unusual report. We've never had one like this that I can remember anyway. Members will recall that you dealt with an application at the last committee, I think it was, 26th of April, for the phase 2 at the Darren Farm site, the land at Northwest Cowbridge, for phase 2 for the 306 homes. That report, which hasn't been, for paper's sake, hasn't been recopied here, but you've had the link for it. That set out that there would be a need for a deed of variation to the original Section 106 agreement on the outline consent to deal with the slight amendment to the affordable housing provision on the site in terms of the mix. That was considered at rather short notice, that we had some representations from the developers to say that they didn't feel that was necessary, and given we didn't have adequate time to assess the matter fully before last planning committee, we put that recommendation on there as a sort of precautionary approach. But we've now had time, our lawyers had time to consider it in more detail, and is happy that actually there isn't a need for that variation. It can be dealt with quite comfortably under the terms of the original legal agreement. So this is just to amend that resolution from last planning committee, so in the absence of a deed of variation.
Great, thank you, Councillor Bird. Oh, Councillor Parker, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yes, I'm happy to support this, and I would like to put it on record that we actually have achieved a 40% affordable housing, contrary to several recent press reports. The mix of housing will certainly ensure that youngsters, young families and everything will hopefully be able to buy into or live in excess of 190 affordable houses that are being provided.
So you're moving officer recommendations?
Move officer's recommendation, yeah.
And Councillor Bird second. Any other comments? All in favour? Aye, thank you. That passes. Moving on to planning applications. Item 11. Start with planning application 2018/00078/FUL 18 Bron Awelon Barry. Vicky?
Thank you, Chair. So this is an application for an extension to a house. Members might recall we did consider a previous iteration for an extension at the rear of this house, which was refused by Planning Committee last year. The details of that are all in the report. So it's been subject to quite a lot of negotiation and amendment on this scheme, and if I can just bring the plans up. So that shows you the existing ground floor. These are the proposed elevations. So you can see on the plan up on the screen, it's the two-storey sort of gable extension at the back, and the side single storey. Again, shown here on the plans, the ground floor plan proposed. You can see quite clearly there the single storey element, which is to the side of the existing semi-detached property, wrapping round, shown with the utility room. Hopefully that's clear. And then above just the at the rear wing, a first floor element to provide a new bedroom on the back, which you can also see is set off somewhat from the boundary with the adjoining semi-detached property. We've also included in here some site photos, which hopefully will help members get an understanding of the proposals. This is taken from the neighbouring garden of the neighbour to the side that doesn't adjoin it, clearly. Now you can see there's already been a two-storey side extension on the property, and that was part of the reason why we were concerned with previous proposals and why it was refused when the proposal was for a full extension, as you can see on page 66 of the officer's report that shows the previously refused plans, and we were concerned about the impact on the amenity of the neighbours there. Hence the reason they've now set that off. It's only single storey, that element of the scheme, and the two-storey element is further away. There have been concerns raised by the neighbours, obviously on this side, and also the neighbours to the rear. If I can draw your attention to this site plan on page 64, you can see that these properties, and if I go back, I think we had that's a photograph taken from the neighbours that back onto this. These two, this pair of semi-detached dwellings are actually further back in the site than you might expect otherwise on the rest of the street. So they do have a rather small back garden, and therefore they're closer to the neighbours at the back behind them. And so there are issues to consider there in terms of whether or not it would be a neighbourly to those to the gardens and to the amenity of the neighbours at the back. The key considerations that we think about when we're looking at those kind of issues, firstly in terms of overlooking, and those issues have been addressed by the inclusion of sorry, bear with me. of obscure glazed window units up to eye height, so you wouldn't be able to overlook into the neighbours' gardens. And then we consider whether or not something is overbearing and oppressive. And when we're thinking about those issues, we normally think about how close it is to the boundary and whether or not it feels oppressive. And in this case, we consider that there is still enough of a gap that it wouldn't be considered to be overbearing on those neighbours. So all in all, after lots of negotiation and amendments, we're now satisfied that this scheme is capable of approval.
Thank you, Vicky. We didn't have anybody registered to speak against the application, but I would like to invite Miss Rhian Lees, who's speaking in favour of the application. Please take your seat. Press the button to speak. When you start talking, you'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Many thanks for the opportunity to speak. My name is Rhian Lees and I'm a Chartered Town Planner. I'm speaking today on behalf of my friends, Mr and Mrs Wells, who are the applicants. The application before you represents the culmination of 2 years of negotiations with the Planning Department, and I'm pleased Mr and Mrs Wells have finally secured a positive officer recommendation. They have a young family but limited space, and like many people, moving to a larger property is simply not possible in the current climate. As such, they are seeking to secure additional floor space in their family home to help ease the pressure. The application comprises a single-storey ground floor extension to increase the downstairs living area and a first floor extension to allow the existing bedrooms to be increased in size, crucially providing enough space for their 2 daughters to comfortably share. The initial design of the extension submitted in this application was much larger and included a 2-storey element that would have impacted on the adjoining neighbours at number 16. This element has now been removed and the first floor extension has also been reduced in size to ensure no detrimental impact on number 16. Whilst the officer report includes reference to objections from the occupiers of number 37 Westward Rise, which sits to the rear, I would respectfully point out that in both this application and that refused in 2017, officers have been clear that the proposal would have no detrimental impact on this property. The key issue is therefore whether the revisions to the design ensure the extension would not be overbearing, lead to any loss of light or increased shading for the occupiers of number 16. As I've previously mentioned, the 2-storey element along the boundary with number 16 has now been removed and the first floor extension reduced in size. The officer report is clear in stating the previous concerns have now been overcome and the proposal is acceptable with regard to the impact on number 16. Briefly, with regard to the impact on the garden suburb conservation area, the proposal will not result in any significant alterations to the appearance of the property when viewed from Bronawellon. When comparing the proposal to other extensions that have been permitted and built in the garden suburb, the impact on the character and appearance of the conservation area really will be minimal. Overall, the application proposes a modest extension to a family home without detriment to the amenity of any adjoining occupiers or the wider conservation area. I therefore respectfully request that you support the officer recommendation and approve the application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before you step down, just in case there's any questions of clarification, obviously covered a large area there. Any member wish to clarify anything? No, thank you very much. Sorry for stopping you there. Thank you. That's great. I'll now open it to the floor. I'll start with Councillor Hodges, please.
Thank you, Chairman. As you can see within the reason for the committee determination, I call this in because, as I stated there, I considered there to be not an appreciable difference to the refusal at the past planning committee and the fact that there is great local concern in respect of the application. I remind committee that the property is located within the Barry Garden Suburb Conservation, and I believe, looking at this scheme and visiting the site on a number of occasions, the impact on the character of the conservation area, such as shading, loss of light, privacy and overbearing, is still relevant to this when we turned this down a couple of years ago. I do not believe that the closeness to the boundary wall is acceptable, and I have to agree with my colleagues on Barry Town Council with their consultation and comments on the initial scheme and also the amended plans. In fact, they raise it to a strong objection, saying that the proposed development, by in terms of its size, design, form and closest to the boundary of number 16 Bronawellon, is both a neighbourly and an overdevelopment of the site. I note that in time the number of bedrooms within the property have bounced up and down. Now, I don't know why that is. If they wish to have a number of bedrooms, that's fine, but a bit consistency within the house and the site would be welcome. I note on page 70, with terms of parking, that numbers of bedrooms can actually decide sometimes the standards for parking guidelines, and I wonder if that was put in as a reason to do that. Chairman, the garden suburb is a jewel within the conservation areas for the Vale of Glamorgan, and on a number of occasions this council has sought to fight and preserve and consider that designation is strengthened, enhanced and maintained. Applications such as this, I do not believe, do that, and I believe that there is to be any consistency within this conservation area, that when we make a decision about overbearing and large extensions, then we should be consistent and keep to that. I appreciate that the scale has been reduced, however, on the occasions that I attended, once with an officer, and measurements were taken eventually when they found their tape, they do not fit the standards that I believe are right and proper for this area within the conservation area. The extension is too close to 37 Westwood Rise's boundary, and I believe that this is not a neighbourly application. Where do I start? That's all I'll say for now, Chairman. I'd like some answers to that. The actual edge to it, though, the bearing on the neighbours on the side, I think is building right to the boundary, and I think is unacceptable. And the very, very, very slight, it looked in fact on the plans that were provided to the Town Council that Tipex had been put on the wall of the original plan, a new line drawn, and that was it. And it was, I believe, a number of inches that had been put in, and committee were not very, very happy with that. So I'm happy to hear the debate as it goes, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Hodges. Vicky?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, obviously, officers disagree with that appraisal of the application. We, for the reasons set out in the report, and as I alluded to in my introduction, we're satisfied that the amendments do overcome the issues of neighbouring concern. On the issue of the conservation area, if I can just draw members' attention to the photograph, which is up on the screen at the moment, and this one, which shows the front of the property. Now, quite clearly, all the proposal is at the back of the house, behind this existing extension, and it's hard to see from that, really, how there is going to be any real perceptible difference in terms of the impact on the character of the conservation area, which is primarily assessed from public vantage points rather than from neighbouring gardens. So the house has already been extended, and there would have been an impact at that time when that side extension happened, which, you know, you could argue was to the detriment of the conservation area. However, we can't reconsider that point. That's already there. All we can consider is what's in front of us, and in that respect I would argue that an extension to the back of the property that can't be seen from the front of the property, where, you know, other than through this gap that you can see here, where, you know, there may be a very slight glanced view of the side of a single-storey extension, I really fail to see how that can be argued that that would detract from the character appearance of the conservation area. So I would be very guarded about any reasons for refusal along those lines. And I think all the other issues in terms of the neighbour impacts have already been addressed, and those are for members to make those judgments yourself, I think.
Councillor Hodges, do you want to come back before Councillor Johnson? Councillor Johnson.
I'll say, I mean, I've visited the site and I remember the original application as well. At the time I was a member of Barry Town Council's Planning Committee. I still feel that this is an unneighbourly development, and it's too close to those houses next door. I just would some clarification on the SPGs regarding conservation areas. I notice there is a reference here in, I think it's the third condition, to the frosted glass, the Pilkington scale, etc. I was just wanting clarification regarding any other building materials that were being suggested or recommended for this as an application, whether those should be, if the committee is minded to approve this, whether that should also be insured within condition as well. Just to clarify, just to have clarified for me.
Vicky? Yeah. One moment.
Sorry, Chair, I just wanted to double check what was on the application forms and the plans. The handwriting on the plans is rather difficult, but it proposes a render finish to match the existing house, so that would be appropriate for the conservation area. Sorry, you did ask for further clarification on what the SPG says. Which SPG are you referring to, sorry?
Regarding conservation areas, just anything within there.
So there's the Barry Garden Suburb Conservation Area. You know, the SPG talks about using appropriate materials, appropriate scale and design, and we're satisfied that this does precisely that.
Councillor Parker.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Page 70 actually covers the question of the materials. The proposed extension would be constructed using matching materials and is therefore considered that the proposal complies with SPG policy MD2, MD8 and SB10. So to help you find it, that's where it is. I've had a very careful look at this following the comments there, and I've looked at the refuse scheme, and I fully support the fact that that was refused. It bears no resemblance to the scheme that we have before us at the moment. And considering it on planning merit, which is what we should do, I think it's the proposal, and I compliment the planning department on actually getting a sensitive and well-considered scheme, and I would actually move officer's recommendation.
First, secondly was Councillor Driscoll. Before we take a vote on that motion, are there any other comments from the committee? In which case, a move, officer recommendations have been moved. All those in favour of officer recommendations? All those against? Thank you. That's everyone, because Councillor Penrose left the room. So that is approved. Thank you. Moving on to our next planning application. 2017/01203/FUL Cogmore's Wastewater Treatment Works, Cardiff Road in Dinas Powys, page 78 in your books. This is Vicky again, introducing this for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Can I just draw members' attention to the matters arising papers that there is a recommended amendment to condition 2, which is the plans condition, just to clarify the approved plan. So that's just a tweak to that. Okay. These plans are quite difficult to read. It's a major development proposal, and albeit we've got them on the screen behind me, I have got a couple of paper copies of the plans as well. So if members are interested and want to have a look at a bit more detail of the proposal, I've got those to hand. But I will start with circulating. I've got 2 of these, so I'll send one round each way. And if I can just show members that this layout plan, Justina's sending the one way. On this plan, the pale grey is what's already there on the site. The dark black lines are the new buildings and structures. The pink areas are the temporary site compounds for construction. Okay, so members can have a little look at those as I'm going through this. So hopefully you've had a chance to have a look through through the officer's report here. This is an application, it's a major development at the existing site of the Cogmore's wastewater treatment works at Cardiff Road in Dinas Powys. It's a proposed advanced anaerobic digestion plant, and it comprises a number of new processes and storage tanks and buildings, together with demolition of and modifications to some of the existing plant and equipment. The officer's report goes through the rigorous process that has led to this site being identified as the appropriate place for Welsh Water to have this anaerobic digestion plant. All the impacts, I'm not going to list the long list of various changes which are set out in the description of development at page 80 of your report. Essentially, there's a lot of infrastructure and tanks there. It includes the proposal of various structures. If you look at page 82, you can see some of the elevations, and they'll be coming up on the screen as well in front of us. Various buildings and structures on the site with feed silos and export silos. The highest structure is a new stack, which is 18 metres high, and just to point out, the existing structures on the site are some 8 to 9 metres tall. So that can be seen in the plans in front of us. We've also got on this, if we keep going down, we've got some of the images taken from the design, from the landscape assessment. So this is the existing site. For those that aren't familiar with the location of it, it's accessed off Cardiff Road via a private road, so it's near Dinas Powys. It's set down somewhat in the valley, so it is largely screened from outside of the existing site. I think that photo is the Cardiff Treatment Works, which is presumably a comparable site. So these images are basically showing the degree to which the application site is screened from wider public vantage points. So there's no getting away from the fact that this is quite a lot of development happening on the site, but in terms of the impacts, they're minimised by virtue of the existing nature of the site, how well screened it is. In this image, I'm not sure, you can't see it very well on the screen, but it is basically showing that you'll see the stack from this point. It is right in the centre. I'm going to attempt to show you. Oh, you can just about see it. I'm not sure if those at the back can see it. The stack is there, so it's basically just above the existing trees. And I think that's the view from the railway line. So for passengers on the railway, they'll just about be able to make out the stack at some distance. Other than that, you know, these images are showing that because it's down in the valley, basically, you know, the visual impacts of it are going to be minimised. And you can see, yeah, you can make out in the image. Hopefully, you can see it on the screen. You can see Dow Corning in the background. This is a view from Downs Farm, looking north towards the site, where you would be able to see the tops of some of the new tanks. In terms of other impacts, obviously we've assessed matters like traffic and environmental impacts, ecology and so on. Those are all addressed in the report. They've been through rigorous examination by all our consultees who are all satisfied with the proposals, and therefore the recommendation is for approval.
Thank you very much, Vicky. We haven't had anybody register to speak against this item, so I'd ask Mr. Howard Jones to please make his way to our speaking point. You'll have 3 minutes once you start talking, sir.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Howard Jones. I'm a planning consultant with Colmert, and we're agents for Welsh Water on this planning application, and I'm speaking in support of the proposed development. Typically, a wastewater treatment process produces a treated liquid effluent which is either discharged to a river or to the sea, and it also produces a sewage sludge which then has to be disposed of. Welsh Water's overall strategy for sludge treatment is based on advanced anaerobic digestion, which represents a sustainable solution. The process releases methane from the sludge, which is then used to generate renewable electricity. The process also produces a fibrous product which can be spread on agricultural land and used as a soil conditioner and as a fertiliser. The proposed anaerobic digestion plant at Cogmoors has been the subject to a range of specialist subjects which accompany the studies which accompany the planning application, and they've been reviewed by both council officers and statutory consultees. In summary, with regard to ecology, both Natural Resources Wales and the council's ecologists are content with the proposed development, and whilst there would be some loss of dormouse habitat, replacement habitat will be provided by way of mitigation. Turning to air quality, Public Health Wales have confirmed that emissions to air will be well within air pollution thresholds and will have no adverse impact on human health. With regard to odour modelling suggests or shows that the proposed development will not result in increased levels of odour. There will be no adverse noise impacts as a result of the proposed development. And whilst there will be a minor increase in HGV movements each day, this will be directed away from Dinas Powys and towards the A4050 junction at the McDonald's roundabout. With regard to visual impact and landscape impact, the area is very well wooded, and additional planting is proposed as part of the scheme, and the development can be assimilated into the landscape without undue adverse impact. I'd request that the committee support this necessary and sustainable development and grant planning permission in accordance with the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. So any questions of clarification? Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, just clarification regarding the construction traffic management plan. As you obviously heard a discussion earlier, you said that it would be coming in via the 4055 from the Bigless Point roundabout. Does that mean your intention is to bring things in via Culverhouse Cross to the northeast of Barry, down the Link Road, and then across from there, rather than through Dinas Powys or any of the Eastern Vale villages?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson, for the reply. Any other questions, clarification? Councillor Driscoll.
Thank you. You say a slight increase in lorries. Can you give us some indication of how many?
At the present time, Cogmoors generates round about 20-21 HGV movements each day. With the proposed development, there would be a further 8 HGV movements per day.
Thank you.
Can I? Yeah, you mentioned that the end product will be used on agricultural land. But am I right in saying that many of the leading supermarkets now won't take product off a field that's been treated with human? Who knows? He said that. Do you understand the question? Yeah.
One of the advantages of the advanced anaerobic digestion process is that it achieves 100% kill of pathogens, and consequently it meets all UK and EU regulations for spreading on agricultural land. That isn't the case with normal anaerobic digesters, where the kill level of pathogens isn't as great, but the AAD plant that's proposed here at Cogmoors will achieve that high kill rate.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas.
A couple of observations. One, 33% is an interesting take on the word slight increase in traffic movements. The other thing is I'm surprised that you claim 100% kill of pathogens, in that any scientist would tell you that you can never be 100% sure of such things, which is why when you in popular adverts they only talk about 99%.
Sorry, Councillor Thomas, what are we clarifying? He's clarified.
It's a clarification of his use of the word 100% kill of pathogens,
okay, so
which is an impossible claim.
Where's that come from?
You just said it.
No, that's actually your clarifying question. Your clarifying question is how is he able to say 100%?
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas.
Jones. There are two questions there. Firstly, with regard to traffic movements, then yes, 33% increase in itself is more than significant. However, in this particular instance, we're talking about a very low base already of existing traffic movements, i.e. 21. So in that respect, an increase of 6 or 8 HGV movements per day compared with the number of vehicles using Cardiff Road, to my mind, represents a slight increase. With regard to the pathogen kill, then you're quite right. 100% cannot be achieved, but nevertheless, it's as close to 100% kill as can reasonably be achieved, and certainly meets all requirements for disposal or spreading to agricultural land.
I've had 2 more requests for clarification questions. I don't want to bleed into the debate. What would you like to clarify, Councillor Penrose? Anything? No, we're not in the debate yet. Okay. Any clarification questions, Councillor Hodges?
I'll do my best.
I don't remember him mentioning odour. Okay, fine.
Basically, stated within the report, there's 2 odour control units which will service the plant to reduce the odour from the sludge treatment process. I was just wondering, in case of failure of a unit or whatever, is there any sort of backup, or what sort of remedial safety features can there be in that?
Yeah, the AED plant is subject to odour control. It's a sealed process, and all connections between road tankers and the process itself are by a Bauer connection, a sealed pipeline. Any emissions that are made to air, as levels rise and fall within a tank, they are passed through odour control units, with the main odour control unit and also standby available in the event of failures.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Jones. I apologise for you, Mr. Thomas. If you step down now, and we'll go, if there's nothing that officers want to say, we'll go into our debate. Thank you. Councillor Penrose.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, I'd like to speak as the local member for Sully, who is probably the area which is most affected by this proposal, to express some of the views and concerns of residents of Sully that have been made over this issue. Firstly, visual, and I'm not going against our officers here, but unfortunately we can't look at this proposal from a flat field. Sully sits, because of the topography of the area, quite high, especially at the cog, so it's looking down on this, and it is not screened from all those houses up there, including the 350 new houses which have been proposed on the top of cog that will equally look down on there. So one of the big concerns of this is the visual one, especially the 18-metre stack. The second concern is odour, as Councillor Hodges made reference to. Over the last few years, there's been numerous complaints on odour from these sewage works. None of them have ever been resolved. They've just been totally denied. But it's a continual thing, and local residents are very sceptical of this new increased plant would be any better, and in fact could be enlarged. The third thing is the fact it's on a floodplain. The report makes reference to various areas that they perceive will be flooded there. It seems quite ironical that we can build a development here quite large, and yet in an application or proposal for a new secondary school on the same plane we can't build it, which is a bit bizarre really. Fourthly, emissions. The concern in Sully from the residents is the collective emissions. We have the biomass plant in Barry, which has raised concerns. We have Aberthorpe Power Station, which at the moment isn't burning but does have emissions. Aberthorpe Cement Works, and now this. And it's not the individual emissions, it's the collective emissions which have been proven by wind flow directions to emulate and come across Sully and Lower Penarth. And the final point really is traffic. To say that an extra 16 HGVs won't make a lot of difference, they will, and I think Councillor Driscoll wouldn't be asking for Dinas Powys bypass if he felt the road was quite clear and could take 16 more trucks a day. The report makes reference to that doubling in 10 years, which our speaker said 30%, but in fact it says 100%. And having been in the transport industry for years, it makes its calculations on two-way trips. But the product's going to be different. And so I think that's a bit of a cop-out, really, by saying two-way trips, because the trucks that go in there will probably be coming out empty, and there'll be other trucks going in empty and coming out, so the numbers will be increased as well. It's obviously got concern. I haven't predetermined. I'm going to listen to the debate as a member of this planning committee, but I do think it's fair just to put across the committee the concerns of the people of Surrey and some in Dinas Powys, but I'm not a member for Dinas Powys. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Penrose. Vicky? Okay.
On the late reps we have in front of us, it has the amending the condition 2, and it has a long list of the various documents used and everything like that. I was just wondering, what's the difference between that and the existing list within the original papers? I find it hard to sort of work out what the difference is.
With that in mind as well, Vicky.
Thank you. It's if you look at the 4 bullet point on page 56 of the matters arising, those are the 4 matters that have changed. So, to be honest, I have to trust my officers have done this for me. I haven't done a, they're inserted or they've replaced previous versions of the same thing. Just that plans condition is a relatively new thing that the Welsh Government introduced for us to do, and it enables people to then make non-material amendments or condition variation applications at a later date to make minor tweaks to future applications. So it's, as you can see from the long list, it's quite a laborious process to go through and make sure that you've got all the amended and correct plans. So obviously the agent has just highlighted that that we hadn't got the most up-to-date versions of a couple of those plans, and that's been corrected. Okay, on the issues that Councillor Penrose has raised, firstly, in terms of the flooding, that is confined to the area that's the temporary construction compound area, and NRW have confirmed that they don't have any concerns and haven't raised any objection to in terms of the flood impacts of the development. The odour issues have obviously already been covered somewhat by the speaker, but again, I just draw members' attention to the officer's report where arguably 3 sensitive receptors in the area will actually see an improvement in terms of existing odour that comes from the site, and our experts who we seek advice on this, including environmental health, are satisfied and happy with the information before us, and obviously that is quite a technical matter. If they're satisfied, then hopefully that reassures members that that issue has been thoroughly assessed and is not going to cause a problem for local residents. Take the point about visibility. Obviously the landscape and visual impact assessment has been undertaken and does demonstrate that there's a negligible impact in terms of the overall level of visibility. In addition to that, I would obviously again remind members that loss of a view from residential properties is not an issue as far as planning committee or a material consideration for us to take into account. In terms of emissions, again, our environmental health colleagues are satisfied with the proposals, as are NRW, and have raised no objections on those grounds. Again, that is quite a technical matter that we rely on their expert opinions when coming to conclusions on those matters. Finally, on traffic, I don't know whether Mike wants to say anything, but I would just say obviously those matters have been assessed by the Highway Authority in terms of, whilst it may not, I think members are quite right in saying it's not actually a small increase in comparison to the existing site, but overall it is still a low number of vehicles coming to and from the site, which is accessed off the primary strategic highway network in Dinas Powys. But Mike is probably much better able to answer that than me.
Yes, thanks, Vicky. I think it's important to remember that the road they'll be exiting on will be, it's an A-class road, and Vicky is correct that the amount of vehicles will be small in comparison to the volumes using that road, and I think we have to be aware that there are capacity issues at peak time, but these vehicles will probably be exiting throughout the day and therefore not be necessarily adding to the peak time traffic as a matter of course. Thank you.
Councillor Penrose first. Councillor Penrose.
Yes, thanks. Taking the points Vicky just answered then, on the visual one, I wasn't claiming it was a loss of view. The residents concerned it's gained an industrial view. It's the first one. On the floodplain, can I just recap that I am right in saying that you could not put any residential developments on a C2 floodplain, and similarly speaking, in the case of a new secondary school, that could not be built. Although in this application, they're admitting to areas which will flood, and that is on the, I think it's the Fluvium plan which we've had, because I worked on the flood committee there for the last 7 years for Sully Moors. The once in a 50-year plan, all that site would be flooded. I know you can't probably speak on that one, so we leave that one to NRW. But on the other two, as I said, it's the point they will be looking on an industrial development from, you can see on the site plan, a very small grey area to a large setup. And as far as the traffic concerned, I did see a caveat in the report saying that if there are more vehicles, we'll look at putting bigger vehicles on so that we don't increase the numbers of measures, which is a, I don't know if that's a threat or a frightening thought. It's one of the two anyway there, but I'm not expecting answers, Vicky, it's just...
Thank you, Councillor Penrose. I had Councillor Bird first, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I think we all forget that this is a facility that is processing our waste, and we need it to be done somewhere. This is the point at which the drains all end up, and this is a marked improvement on what is being done at the moment. So with that in mind, I will move officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Are you seconding? No, fine. I'll put you down on my list. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a fair point. That I remember in the preparation for the LDP, one of the concerns was the capacity around the Cogmore's waste treatment. So anything that can be done, sort of at that site that makes it more useful. It actually means that rather than simply moving things around South Wales, having them on that site is probably a good thing. With regards to floods, I suppose maybe Welsh Water know something about sort of how water falls and what happens to it. Who knows? I'm not an expert myself on the anaerobic digestion, but it is something that is made a lot of promises is made about it. I'm not, like I say, I'm not planning on suggesting that I'm an expert or anything. I'd like to hear more. Perhaps it might be more interesting for us more generally as a council to hear about the work that goes on at Cogmore's, because it does affect all of the different properties that we have sort of in and around us, and any concerns or failure that we might have that might happen at that site in future would be of great importance. Also, just my question, and it was perhaps flagged up by Councillor Penrose, and I don't mean to be flippant, but I'm just checking that the site of this and the increase in any land being used would not affect the proposals for a Dinas Powys bypass. I do note that although the proposal here is that they would come down the 4050 and down through the Link Road and turn left into 4055. Obviously, the rear of the site, as it were, is quite close to Sully Road, which we were discussing earlier, and obviously that's not too far away from, or not a million miles away from, what would be the route of a Dinas Powys bypass. So it'd be a nice way for them to link onto the bypass when it's built, which I'm sure will be by 2019 when this is operational. But in more general terms, does this have any impact upon the route that might take? So just a question for Mike, I suppose, there more than anybody else.
Mike.
I'll help Mike out there, because I have had a little bit of involvement in terms of the route. This is all these proposed works are within the existing, treatment facility, and any proposed route for the bypass would need to avoid that facility. So, this is not going to impact on any potential future proposals for the bypass, which are obviously not in front of us anyway. But does that answer your inquiry?
I'm sure you're asking to find out the information, so now we know. Councillor Driscoll.
I have to concur with our councillor from Sully over there. We do get complaints of smells, but by the time the complaints are made, the smell is gone. In answer to Councillor Johnson, I don't think this is increasing the capacity. I think it's just it's not going to increase the capacity if it can take more. It's just the anaerobic digester, and it'll be bringing in loads more lorries from elsewhere. I do question the estimate of lorries, because they're spending 48 million pound on this plant, and just to increase it by 5 or 6 lorries a day doesn't actually make a lot of sense in my eyes. Another aspect of I have actually been to the plant, and it's a quite fascinating process, and I recommend it to everybody, and it's a very well kept plant, and it's well worth a visit. Thank you.
There was a question there as well, but I'll go to Peter King, who I did promise I'd come to, sir. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Chair. I think a couple of councillors mentioned the point about having a better understanding of what happens after we flush the loo. Wouldn't be a bad idea generally, but that's the problem, isn't it? It's once out of sight, then it's out of mind. We've got to accept, we've got to deal with the stuff. And the bit I have some sympathy with my colleague from Sully is over screening, because on a drawing like this it's extremely hard to judge the topography. But if there is a height advantage from the developments at Sully, is there any way we can ask Vicky's officers to reconsider whether there could or should be some better form of screening? I mean, I'm not advocating Leylandia. I would never ever do that. But I mean, some sort of screening with trees or something that I think that might be worth. It's not that expensive, I wouldn't have thought.
Thank you, Councillor King. Vicky, do you want to make any comment on that?
Yeah, it's an extremely large development, and I think in terms of further screening, that is going to be difficult to achieve without that having some potentially adverse impact on the landscape. All I can say is that the landscape and visual impact assessment that's been submitted to support the application has demonstrated that the landscape impacts are minimised. That's been thoroughly assessed by our landscape expert as well as the case officer, and they've also concluded that actually the development itself is largely screened by existing trees in the vicinity, which is obviously shown in these photo montages in front of us. So that has been already assessed. And sorry, I think we've lost the projector. Technical whiz, yeah, by all means, we can look at whether or not there are any additional landscaping that could be introduced to minimise the impact of it further. But without those details in front of me, I can't give you any more information than that.
Councillor Thomas.
Yeah, this is really listening to the discussion, and when we're talking about the fact that it's a floodplain and how serious that is, given what's happening with climate change and the increase in numbers of extreme weather events, okay, not particularly around here recently, but in other parts of the UK over the last few weeks, where we've seen flash flooding and intense downpours striking randomly, and we can expect them round here by under Sod's law. What sewage and floodwaters tend to mix rather than not mix, and that can cause problems to the surface water, rivers and streams that are passing near to this site as well. What mitigation is there against that? And do you anticipate problems of that sort? And have you got anything in place?
Previously, you clarified it was the construction compound only that was affected by the flood zone. Is that right? If there may be additional points that Councillor Thomas is making.
Yeah, you know, those matters are given rigorous examination by our drainage experts and by NRW, both of whom are satisfied with the proposal. You know, there are plenty of examples where they have objected to planning applications in flood zones. You know, some of the matters that Councillor Penrose has alluded to. I'm more than happy to do a session on flooding for members about how those matters are looked at. But I don't think, you know, now's the time. All I can say is for this application, we're satisfied that the flooding issues have been adequately addressed and are not going to cause problems. If it was a case of flooding was likely to inundate the treatment works, then clearly NRW would have raised an objection to it.
Two more people who've indicated to speak. Councillor Hodges first.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate Councillor Bird's already moved a motion. Wait for laugh. Can I just ask a question? There was a suggestion by Councillor Driscoll that it wasn't going to increase capacity. Well, I look at the description of development on page 80, and the first thing it says is provides for additional digestion capacity. Now, we've been around long enough to know that there's various schemes, new housing schemes dotted around that would feed in to this, and there's always been that question of would the plant eventually be able to cope, or is it at capacity? And I was just wondering, because I've not been able to find it anywhere, is it actually extra capacity, and could you give us an idea of how much? Because is this either an application for an improvement of the plant and its technology, or is it an improvement in the plant and its technology and an improvement in the capacity? Because we have been asking for and been told for years that we need more capacity. And I was just wondering what the situation was.
Okay, Vicky.
Thank you. If I can just draw you to page 80, it does say the proposed development would provide for, bullet point 1, additional digestion capacity. So that's the entire intention of, you know, they're going to be spending an awful lot of money on this site to do this work, and it's obviously worthwhile them doing it for their future operations. You know, the report sets out all the different other options they were looking at in terms of other treatment plants. This is a major investment for Welsh Water, and they've considered, you know, various options across Wales. This is the one they've gone for, being the best in terms of all of its impacts and its deliverability, and clearly they're doing so as part of their programme to deal with waste. Okay.
Councillor Birds. Sorry.
Sorry, I don't have that information immediately to hand. So, you know, by all means, I can send you that information after today.
Councillor Bird.
I think we're forgetting one critical thing, that water flows downhill. And that generally sewage treatment plants are at the bottom of the run where they discharge their clean processed product into a stream, ditch, river, sea, whatever. So we're getting a little bit het up on flood issues when NRW have already said to us they're happy with it, they're the specialists. Welsh Water, again, they're specialists in handling water. I don't see why we're getting het up over this flood issue. And two, we're forgetting this is improving the product that is coming out of there. It's making it a cleaner, safer product that is coming out. At the moment, currently, coming out of there every day is sludge that is fairly untreated. It's pretty raw stuff. This will be a product that the pathogens, 99% of, will be not in there. Currently there are an awful lot of pathogens in there. As far as I can see, this is a vast improvement. It's an increasing capacity, and I think we should be supporting this.
Thank you. Councillor Penrose. It's the last one on my list.
Yes, it was only two short one-liners. To answer Nick's question, yes, reading the report, it is an increased capacity, but that's because it's importing effluent as well to be treated at the works. That's coming from other areas, I believe. And the second thing is flooding. That's the one thing which we're talking about, the building on a floodplain. The residents of Surrey being higher up haven't got to worry. Untreated effluent, should it flood, would be washed down as it always does when we flood towards Barry. It doesn't go towards Surrey that way, and I don't mean that disrespectfully to Barry, but unfortunately there will be untreated product there if there was a flood. Yeah. Sorry, and it has flooded in the past, but...
You've made your point, Councillor Bird. We're all aware. This is the last point for Gallopants Road. We've had a motion. I'm going to move. That motion is voted on now. So we've had a movement of officer recommendations. All those in favour? All those against? And that's everyone. Thank you. That motion passes. Planning application passes. Moving on to our third planning application. 2017/00955/FUL, former RS Garage, Windsor Road in Penarth. Who's speaking on this? Vicky?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to those members who attended the site visit this morning at Penarth. We haven't got any matters arising on this one, so I'll just go into the main report. So this application is to convert the existing building, which was a former garage stroke retail building, and to accommodate a mixed-use scheme comprising a D2 gym use at ground floor, which already has planning permission, and a further 12 residential flats above it, comprising 4 one-bed and 8 two-bed apartments. The building is being retained and converted with the addition of an extension to the side to provide for stairs and lift to access the flats, and an additional flat on top of the existing building. In addition, there's proposals to ramp down into the basement to provide 12 parking spaces to serve the flats, in addition to the 8 parking spaces that are provided on the front facing onto Windsor Road to serve the gym. The proposal includes an arrangement where there's a traffic light system to serve that basement parking area, with a parking space for one vehicle to wait while anybody that's coming up the ramp is coming out of the car park. As you'll see from the proposals, the application includes a sort of internal courtyard area that can be seen on page 124 of the officer's report. So that provides a sort of garden space within the building itself. It's slightly unusual. It's in a void within the building, so there's a wall adjacent to that where it's next to the neighbouring property. So there's no issues in terms of overlooking to that side of that property. All the issues to do with parking, drainage, etc. have all been assessed and are set out in the report, so I won't dwell on those, but I think it's worth probably picking up the planning obligations issue, as no doubt there will be some debate about that. As a major development for 12 residential units, we would apply the planning obligations supplementary planning guidance and expect some section 106 contributions to be paid on this development. The normal expectations are set out in pages 128 through to 131 of the officer's report. However, the report then goes on to deal with development viability issues. So, as might be expected on a brownfield site, there are significant development costs involved in converting this building to residential, which unfortunately result in very limited viability for anything extra in terms of Section 106 or affordable housing. The information submitted to support and demonstrate that viability case has been robustly assessed by the district valuer, who is a sort of independent third party that we use to analyse that information. And in doing so, they've concluded that there is only the ability for a payment of £24,264 to be made to the council, and officers are recommending that that contribution would be utilised towards affordable housing in the Penarth area. So the recommendation is therefore for approval, subject to a Section 106, making provision for that payment, and also securing the early completion of the development within 24 months, reflecting the sort of viability restrictions on this application, and approved subject to conditions.
Thank you, Vicky. We have had nobody registered to speak on the application, either against it or for it, so I'll ask Councillor Thomas to open up our debate. Thank you.
As I indicated earlier, I want to allude to some of the figures from the District Valuer's report, which come under Part 2 of the, and perhaps I should really reserve my comments to later when we can ask people to leave and continue under part 2, if that's okay with everyone.
Just to explain to those present, if we've got questions about viability and the members wish to look at the commercially sensitive information, we do have access to that information. I would rather deal with the debating points that we can deal with in part 1, which is the open part of our meeting. We'll then move into part 2 to deal with any points to do with that, which would involve the public gallery being emptied and any member here who's not a member of the council or a council employee would need to leave the chamber. We'll then debate that and then open again in part 1 before we make a decision. We won't make the decision in part 2. Just explain that to the public gallery if it is so moved that we go to part 2. I've had Councillor Bird first. Yeah, point of order for Councillor Johnson.
Well, it was really, if this is likely to move to a part 2 debate, would it make more sense for us to deal with the remaining planning application first before this one, so that then we can go to part 2 and let people afterwards?
So in our planning agenda conference, I've already identified that is also likely to result in somebody possibly asking for us to go to part 2 in view of the numbers within that. If you've read the report, I'm sure you'd agree with me with a 17% housing viability number. So unfortunately, both of them are here, so that is why I've listed the agenda as I have. So if we can move on to any other points with regard to parking, arrangements, drainage, any other comments. Councillor Thomas, did you have anything else you wanted to say before I opened it to my list?
It does need to go to part 2 for this. It is in terms of parking. The number of car parking spaces being put aside for both for the residential side is I believe 12, but according to the report and highways, at least one of those seems to be unviable in that there's not enough room to turn within the, if I'm reading it rightly, within the garage, the undercroft garage, so the actual numbers aren't representative of the reality.
Vicky?
Thank you, Chair. I believe those comments were made before we received this amended layout. You can see from the plan that's up on the screen here that there are clearly 12 parking spaces which have manoeuvring space behind them, so there's no reason why those spaces shouldn't be able to be used. I don't know whether, Mike, you've got any observations on that?
I agree with you, Councillor Thomas. When I saw the original plans, I counted 11 spaces, and I questioned that, and I saw the revised plans did have 12. In fact, it has 14 spaces, but 2 of them are accessed behind the front 2. Councillor Wright, if you leave, you won't be able to vote on the application. Okay, fine. Yeah, there are 12 spaces accessible on the current plans, but they may well have been responding to the previous iteration. Mike?
Yes, sorry, just having a quick look at the layout on the computer. It does appear to me that there is sufficient space to and manoeuvrability to occupy all spaces.
Great, let's clarify that one. Next on my list is Councillor Bird.
Just a query. Viability, I understand we're going to debate afterwards, but I just wondered if we could amend the conditions that if this development does make a little bit more money than anticipated, can we have a clawback in there? I know it's been done on previous developments, maybe not in the Vale of Glamorgan, I can't remember, but I certainly know of ones outside that, and I was just keen that I do understand that the DV has gone through all of that, and I accept those figures, but I am keen that if things change and these flats become more valuable and they make a little bit more money, that we have our part of it.
Vicky?
I'm just being mindful of what I say in a part 1 debate. There is guidance on how you deal with viability, and produced by the Welsh Government, and in addition to that, there's quite a lot of case law and appeals and so on. So first thing is you have to take account of viability. You can't ignore it. Having said that, if something drops down to the point of viability where actually it makes the development unacceptable, we would be recommending refusal. Okay, so it's always a matter of balance and whether or not something is still acceptable on planning grounds. So there are examples where we would say viability now at this point in time is quite clearly an issue. However, this development is going to be built out over many, many years, and there's every chance that viability is going to change. Therefore, it's reasonable to have review mechanisms where you re-look at all of the profitability and so on, and we have done that on a couple of occasions. However, when it's a development as small as this, and you've looked at the viability at this point in time, there has to be a degree of saying, well, actually, that has all been assessed. And unless there's something in the viability which you think, actually, that's really likely to change in the very small time, only in those situations would it be appropriate to introduce quite onerous viability clawbacks. That became very clear to us in an appeal where we were dealing with the dolphin application at Barry Island. So we do have to be guarded and careful about when we impose those restrictions. What we're not allowed to do is impose a development tax, if you like, and basically impose on development and say, well, actually, we're willing to grant you planning permission for this, but if you go ahead and you make extra super profit or whatever, then we're going to have our share of that. You're not allowed to do that lawfully, okay? And there's a recognition really in planning that when developers undertake development, they do so with a degree of financial risk involved, and actually in doing so, if they do manage to make slightly more profit, then that's okay in planning terms, much as that may well grate against you when you're looking at a reduced Section 106 package. That has to be balanced against the fact that we robustly assess those matters now and make sure that actually everything in front of us is absolutely credible, that the build costs are properly justified and examined, that the development costs are so on and so forth, so that when we're making this decision now, we're happy with that decision in terms of the reasonableness of those assumptions in the viability appraisal.
Okay, thank you. I've got 4 people wishing to speak. Councillor King is first on my list.
Thank you, Chair. It's really a point of clarification whether I need to say this or not, but presumably once we get to part 2, then they will not be webcast either, and therefore there's a part of me which says I think some things perhaps need to be said so that the public understands what the issue is, but I perhaps need some guidance about that, because I know what I would probably have said if it was all going to be in part 1. If it's going to be in part 2, it would make more pertinence there. But I'm just thinking that if I'm a member of the public watching this at home, thinking what is going on, they may not grasp.
It will be in connection to physical numbers, the actual commercially sensitive information. So statements about whether or not you agree with Welsh Government policy around viability levels, that's obviously a part 1 issue. The rules around how the viability is come about would obviously be something we can debate now. So maybe in the next 3 submissions. Absolutely.
Thanks ever so much for that clarification. The site is almost on the border between St Augustine's and the Cornwall wards, and the report notes that the council's own housing strategy unit identify a need for 165 and 99 units respectively. 264 affordable units are needed in that area now. So when you read to the conclusion that an off-site contribution of just over 24k, which would possibly pay for the footings of a front door, it isn't even a dent. And the problem that I've got, certainly representing a Penarth ward, is that this has happened quite recently with Northcliffe. Northcliffe is a multi-million-pound development, of which apparently, there is absolutely no chance of any contribution towards anything else because of this whole issue about commercial viability. And I have to say it is exceedingly hard as somebody who has a small understanding to accept, and I think the public and the residents of Penarth are bewildered. And earlier on, my colleague Councillor Parker spoke with gratitude about how a recent development in his area benefited from a significant contribution of affordable housing. It doesn't help me explain this any better to the people of Penarth when there's naught for them. I mean, my maths is that this would have generated something approaching £750,000 in Section 106 money under its various headings, and that's been reduced to 24k. I am stunned.
Vicky?
Thank you, Chair. I think members, I take the point entirely. I take the point. What members need to remember is when we set our SPG levels, we set them very high. And here in the Vale, we are massively successful in securing Section 106 across the board because we have that policy support, that SPG support, and the approach that we've been taking for 15 years on Section 106 matters. It's a best case scenario really that's set out in the SPG. Okay, so on a greenfield site on the edge of Cowbridge, in probably the most viable area in the Vale of Glamorgan, you can push for those sort of levels of contribution, 40% affordable housing, plus a new road, plus a new school, and all the other things, and it's because the viability stacks up there. Unfortunately, it does have the somewhat negative effect then of raising people's expectations that can be achieved in every single part of the Vale and on every single site, and it's simply not the case that that's going to be achieved on brownfield sites in settlement boundaries, particularly 1 and 2 bed flats where it is going to cost the developer a lot of money to convert this existing building. In addition to that, we have to take account of what the existing building is worth. So it's not just a greenfield site that's worth agricultural land values, if you like. It is an existing going concern with consent for a gym at ground floor, and so that has been taken into account in the existing use value and what the developer pays to buy the building in the first place. We, by all means, if you want to go into part 2 and rigorously look at all of the figures that have been examined by the district valuer, we can do that, and we have that information to hand. All I would say is officers absolutely fight tooth and nail with developers to get the maximum that we can out of them for 106, and we don't lightly put a recommendation forward to committee where the level of contributions is as low as it is for this. But we can't refuse development that is otherwise bringing an awful lot of benefits, albeit it's not delivering on-site affordable housing. It is nevertheless delivering 12 new units of housing, which housing, whether it is affordable or market, is much needed in Penarth. In addition to the gym use, it's in a sustainable location, the parking provision is there, it's reuse of an existing building. It ticks a lot of boxes in terms of the planning merits of the application, and for that reason we're recommending approval, irrespective of the fact that unfortunately it's not going to make the same sort of contributions towards Section 106 that we might get on other more viable sites.
Next on my list, Councillor Penrose.
Thanks. I mean, I could make comment on that point, with my education hat on, and that is people who move into those flats, the likelihood some will have children, they respect education places which the authority has to pay for, which normally would come from Section 106 as well, but it's not the case, and I won't labour that one. I was really going to talk on the mundane one of, I noticed Highway's concern of the traffic light system for entering and exiting the parking facility onto the main road, and the likelihood. It's just a suggestion really whether that could be helped if access was only coming in from Penarth direction to access it and not coming across when they're coming from the Cardiff direction. Because of the road layouts around it, it's quite possible only to access, which at least would mean if people are waiting for the traffic lights to go in, they would only be held up on the curbside of the one direction rather than in the middle of the White Road line waiting to turn in from the other direction. It's probably a rubbish idea, but it's just a thought.
Thank you, Councillor Penrose. Mike?
I think probably it will be difficult to control that sort of movement. Certainly the police wouldn't want to be in a position to try and enforce that. I think obviously the highways have put an objection in on the basis of there could be a detrimental impact on highway grounds, but I think based on the number of units that are being delivered, the risk is fairly low that there will be a detrimental impact in relation to the movements and the traffic light system being used. So, you know, despite there being an objection in, I'm reasonably relaxed about the proposal in terms of traffic movements.
Councillor Parker, next on my list.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to seek clarification on the practicality of condition 1 and the recommendation, because it says, and I understand the reason why, obviously, the development shall be begun no later than 18 months from the date of this decision. And then just above, it says securing completion of the development within 24 months or reviewing the viability of the scheme. Now, does that mean they get 24 months from the start of development, or does it mean they got six months in which to complete it, which obviously practically they couldn't achieve it? Because I can well see you start, and if the market is buoyant, you'd move quickly, and if the market is not, you would wait until the market was suitable to sell them at an enhanced figure, maybe.
Vicky.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so the intention of those two restrictions is 1, that it has to start within 18 months, and 2, that it has to be complete within 24 months of the date of the decision. Okay. So, in other words, yes, it is giving them 18 months to start, but in reality, if they want to comply with that 24-month restriction, they're going to start a lot sooner than that, you would expect. And it's not saying it has to be complete within 24 months. It's saying if it's not, then we're going to have to open up and relook at viability. So there will be...
Does completion mean sale of all the units or completion of the project?
No, it would normally be just completion of the project, so completion to the point where they're all capable of occupation.
Thank you. Councillor Cave is next on my list.
Thank you, Chair. I've listened to what Vicky has to say, and thank you very much. It's been very informative. I'm sure, like everybody else here, I'm really appalled, really, at the sustainable housing contribution that we're having here. And this isn't in isolation. This occurs quite regularly. And I can see that in one way, we're really in the hands of the district valuers, and we're really beholding to them. So I'm just wondering, so I've got two questions. Do we as a council look at the district valuer's estimate, because it is an estimate or a guesstimate, and then look at the reality? Do we then go back? So do we as a council have some figures where we have to rely on the district valuer's figures, and then later on when everything is developed and sold, do we then have a way of comparing those two over time? Because we compare a lot of other things, don't we? So I'm just wondering, do we do that? And if we don't, could we do that? And secondly, I'm just thinking, in terms of affordable housing, we seem to be cutting that budget quite a lot when we still keep quite high rates for all the other things that Section 106 covers. And obviously, as my colleague Bob Penrose has pointed out, he has got a reduction in the Section 106 for education. But the other 106 matters seem to be quite high, and correct me if I'm wrong here, in relation to the sustainable housing contribution.
Vicky.
Just to be clear, what's being proposed here are 0 contributions for anything other than affordable housing. So affordable housing in this case has been prioritised above all the other contributions. The reason for that is obviously it is quite a small pot in any event. It's going to have limited impact for whatever facilities you choose. But officers are recommending that it gets used towards affordable housing because we do have other pots of affordable housing contributions in Penarth, and because affordable housing need is very, very high in Penarth, it's the highest area of need. So that's why it's being prioritised there. Each case we look at what's the appropriate balance of Section 106 package. So, for example, because of the sustainable location of this site, and its proximity to local open space already, we've given less weight to sustainable transport contributions and public open space rather than affordable housing. So it's a bit of a balance, and it is up to members to disagree with that officer recommendation and to put the contribution elsewhere if you'd like to. The fact remains that, you know, the viability basically only frees up that amount of money, and that's got to be used for something, and we're suggesting that's affordable housing. In terms of the district valuer's role, so firstly, when it comes to policy, we have a degree of expertise in-house that we can call on our estates and valuation departments anyway, and also a wealth of experience that we have developed over years of dealing with Section 106 matters and viability matters, largely since the crash around 2007, 2008. We've been dealing and looking at these matters, so we do have a large volume of work where we are familiar with build costs, with site acquisition and professional fees and all the rest of it. Having said that, we're all planning officers, and so it's not our absolute area of expertise, and that's the role of the district valuer. So the district valuer is acting for us as a council. They are in our corner. They are an independent person who is scrutinising that information. So we may well still have a conversation with them if we felt, hang on, we've got other evidence in the area that suggests that the sales values you've accepted are not quite right, or the land values or what have you. So we will interrogate that information. We don't just take it as read, but there does have to be a degree of trust in the district valuer, because they are completely acting independently and they are aware of what our policies are, and they are just scrutinising whether or not what the developer has put forward is the right information and the right assumptions to be used for that development site.
Supplementary, Councillor Cave?
Yes. So do we do that comparison? Do we have a way of looking at those figures and seeing if we are actually being able to add them up? So what the district valuer is saying and what actually happens at the end of the day.
Yes, we do. So we compare them with published information like the Build Cost Information Service, generate standard build costs and things. When it's abnormals, because a particular site needs a particular type of construction, then we do pretty much rely on the district valuer, who use a quantity surveyor to robustly interrogate that information. But remember, it's not the developer that's putting forward those figures, it's a third party who is acting independently, saying actually that's a reasonable cost assumption. Like I'm sure many of you have been involved in build projects, and costs go up and down throughout the life of a development, and things can change. So it's always going to be an estimate to a certain extent, but yes, we do interrogate the information in front of us, whether that's from the developers or from the district valuer, and we will look at other comparable evidence that we have to assess that.
Back. So I hear everything you're saying, but there is a difference. There's a lag, isn't there? There's a gap between when it's about to be built, when it's seeking permission, and when it's actually built and put on the market. And I'm just wondering if that lag, whether we ever look at the figures that we think it's going to come to and the figures that it actually does come to. And that's my only point there.
We do look at those things. It's almost just an exercise in learning lessons, isn't it, really? And we do that on ones where we have previously had viability cases and they have or haven't stacked up, and then you use that to inform future decisions and future policy approaches, and it's an ongoing process, really.
At this time, I'm going to ask, obviously we've had an extensive conversation around the policy aspects of viability and some of the commentary about the district valuer's role. There's a request to move part 2. I will ask the committee if they would like to move part 2 and a vote on that, because some people may have just wanted to have a debate about the policy rather than physically looking at the figures. I appreciate that. So all those in favour of moving part 2? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those against moving part 2? Any abstentions? One abstention. Okay, so on the basis of where we are now,
Right, in that case,
Councillor
I'd like
Thomas.
to put my points now and try to avoid stepping on part two. This site's an eyesore at present, and I would welcome a development here. The change of use to D2 Gym was determined last October by this committee and contributes to the viability of the development. It's a brownfield site situated in the main highway through Penarth and within easy walking distance of all amenities, including the Dingle station. So quite rightly, the sustainable transport thing can be looked at in the way that Vicky described. It has already been established that St Augustine's ward has the lowest proportion of social housing in Penarth. Unfortunately, this development not only does nothing to improve that awful position, it in fact makes it worse. At 40%, we would expect 4.8 units of social and affordable housing, which would be rounded up to 5 units, 2 one-bed, 2 two-bed, both all 4 social rented, and 1 two-bed affordable affordable sale. They've actually, instead of doing that, they've rounded down to 0. Nice round number. Were the developers made to adhere to the rules of the LTP and the guidance, we would also expect Section 1 and other contributions in terms of social housing would amount to roughly 400 grand for the housing aspect, plus 110. The other figures are in your thing. 26,400 to sustainable transport, 110,458, I think, to education, as Bob's referred to, and 32 grand to public open space, plus a 1% contribution to public art, which by my calculation amounts, all included, amounts to way north of £500,000. Now, the District Values Report has again been accepted. The developers' figures on viability have reduced this to this £26,264, which to my mind is risible. The people in this ward have already taken a north of £1 million hit on Northcliffe Lodge, where they have had to, they are subsidising the development in terms of the education element, in terms of the highway element, in terms of the sustainable transport, in terms of all this, and particularly in terms of the public housing, to way above £1 million. This is another way above £500,000 to add to that debt that the people of this ward are having to pay off, and I find that unacceptable. I think there are better words. Once again, parking. I talked about parking in the area. The message to developers, if we allow this, is build in Penarth, and the Vale Council will make local taxpayers subsidise your profits, because there will be profits on this. What I'm not allowed to refer to in this is the value of the flats, which I've seen. The value of the entire development, which I've seen, because that's part of the commercial part 2 stuff. So the value is in there, the profit is in there. The developers are expected to make a 20% profit on the development at least. So it's, don't worry if your proposals are overly ambitious. Don't take account of community needs. The local community will pay. I oppose this development as it stands and would urge the committee to send this proposal back to be redesigned to a degree that it is viable and can make a reasonable contribution to the community. We would expect it if it were anywhere else in the Vale, like Cowbridge. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Councillor Birds was first on. I'll note you.
Yeah, I'm just staggered at that reaction, actually. You said in your first instance that that the place is an eyesore and you want it developed. It's not going to be developed if you insist on having money and the developer is making no profit at all. In fact, probably making a loss at that level. Vicky explained earlier that the guidance is best case scenario. When you're in certain areas, you can't sell for high amounts, and I'm just staggered that you can't understand that. I just move officer's recommendation.
So hold on a second. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Thank you. First time I pressed the button ever. There's a second over there from Councillor Rowlands for officer recommendations. Councillor Hodges is next on my list. I think everyone has made the points they wish to make in the debate. Councillor Hodges and then Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chairman. I hope I don't cut across anything that would have been perhaps better debated under Part 2. Bit disappointed that was voted down. That was strange. In the preamble, it says here that the building is not listed, nor is it locally listed as a county treasure, which never gives any defence anyway. And it's also located outside the boundary of the Penarth Conservation Area. Now, if I can't look at or discuss or go into the minutiae of costings, valuations and whatever to know what the situation is, I'll have to make my own estimates and views thoughtful. Now, we've had this before where we're told that a scheme would be unviable if a 106 of any description is paid on it. We've had that on a number of schemes in Barry before, and I accepted that for one church development, which was award-winning and excellent, because there was a lot of conservation work that needed to be done, and the resulting conversion was absolutely wonderful, and I understood that that would cost more. Now, it is the developer's own decision, surely, that they are going to convert. If this building is not listed, locally listed, considered nice, precious, or even interesting, why don't they knock it down? Will that give a different value? Will that make the costings better? Conversion, I understand, of a not particularly salubrious building can cost money. If they actually cleared the site altogether and built from new, would that have a difference in the costings, profitability and viability? I don't know, because I'm not allowed to discuss it now, and I'm not allowed to see the figures, and I'm not allowed to go into any depth in it in private. So I have to say that 20-odd thousand for a prime site in a centre of a thriving town is derisory, and I have concerns, and if I can't have a debate on the viability, I will have to vote against it.
Thank you, Councillor Hodges. So in terms to just... That's why it's last. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I think I share Councillor Hodges' surprise that we're not discussing Part 2 issues. I'm struggling to remember when we last had a discussion that actually where this seems to be the cornerstone of it, and yet the committee decided they didn't want to discuss issues in that detail. I don't know if councillors have been on this committee or on the council longer than me can remind me when that might have been. I have obviously the nature of viability is, as we've been informed previously, a 20% profit for the developers. I'm wondering, in the development of this, in the process of the development of these proposals, whether consideration has been given to demolishing the current building and starting again. I'm wondering if the planning officer can talk about that and explain the process of reaching this, where we have an exclusive private development within a prime area. In the last meeting of this committee, I was told by a planning officer who's not present today that social housing outweighs almost all other considerations. Now, that was for a town centre development of exclusive affordable housing within my ward. And I don't really understand how we have a situation that's grown up where in one town in the Vale of Glamorgan we have exclusively affordable housing developments that come about because of the excessive need for affordable housing, often as a result of the bedroom tax that is a government policy that drives our housing need. whereas in other places it's considered perfectly acceptable to have purely exclusively market value flats being developed on a site that is of equal prominence in terms of local central viability, sustainable traffic management, green areas, etc., etc. I am struggling to understand how we have one set of policies that apply to Barry and a different set of policies that apply to Penarth, and we end up in a situation where the town centre councillors in both of those areas are frustrated because this isn't actually delivering what we need.
Correct.
Vicky.
I do take issue with that to a certain extent. The policies are the same and they are applied the same. And if this was a proposal for 100% affordable housing, I've no doubt we would be recommending approval for it. It's not what's in front of us. What's in front of us is this scheme. A registered social landlord has not bought this site and wants to develop it for 100% affordable housing. I doubt whether a registered social landlord would be able to afford this site because of the value of the site. You know, therefore, you can't compare the two schemes in the same way. That other scheme, the site had been purchased and procured by a registered social landlord and had found, you know, sufficient development viability within it to enable them to develop 100% affordable housing. That's not what's in front of us. This is the scheme in front of us, and we are duty bound to determine this application on its planning merits, having regard to all the planning policies. We've done that, and we've put forward a recommendation to you on that basis. You're right in suggesting that alternatives need to be considered as to whether or not, if a developer is proposing something where we can clearly see the reason that they're proposing it is to try and circumvent the planning policies and the appropriate Section 106 contributions, then we certainly interrogate that scheme and would most likely recommend a refusal of a scheme on that basis. Say, for example, if someone was proposing, you know, very large flats that are sort of super profit, super cost, all the rest of it, that aren't justified. What we've got here is the really good conversion of an existing building, which is sustainable on anyone's assessment of it, I would argue, and that we really shouldn't be encouraging needless demolition and rebuild. And even if we did, the costs would not be significantly different because you'd have additional demolition costs. And you'd still be, a lot of the reasons why this site and the viability of this site is because the site itself has a value, has an existing use value, which is what I was talking about earlier when I referred to it's not a greenfield site that has agricultural land value, it's an existing use that has an existing value, and that wouldn't change irrespective of whether or not you knocked the building down or whether or not you converted it. The build cost would change, but arguably what would need to be built in terms of a new building here would be, you know, potentially a larger building with different impacts in order to address the viability issues. So it comes back to the fact that we do have to ultimately consider the proposal that's in front of us, and if that proposal is considered to be acceptable, then it would be unreasonable of us to be refusing it just simply because it's not giving as much affordable housing or other Section 106 obligations as we would like.
Okay, I've had a motion to move officer recommendations. I think we've moved through everything we can discuss around within. Yeah, but that wasn't seconded. The first motion it wasn't seconded before. The first motion for officer recommendations was moved and seconded. So that's the first one we will be. Yeah, your motion will be got to if the first motion falls because it was moved. It was seconded after the first motion was moved and seconded. So we're moving officer recommendations is the first motion in front of the committee. All those in favour of moving officer recommendations? All those against? And that is everyone. That motion carries. The planning approval is given on officer recommendations. I'd like to propose a 5-minute comfort break before our final application. Back in here in 5 minutes, please. my very mean 5 minutes is expired. If we could make sure the agent and the people associated with the next planning application are back in the room. Oh, they're coming in. No. Yes, they're coming in now. I think that's the last coffee through the machine. Ask you to please take your seats, ladies and gents. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and there may be a few people who need to rejoin us in the public gallery if word can get to them that we're going to restart. I'd like to resume. Where's Councillor Parker? And Councillor... Oh, they both left because they're not part of this thing. They had declared interest in this final application. So moving on to our final planning application this evening, 2016/01427. It's outline permission for land off Cowbridge Road in St Athan. It's page 100 and now it'll be 114 on my list. 144 in your papers. Vicky.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you again to members who came on the committee site visit this morning, where we were able to have a good look at the site and consider the site itself. So this application is in outline with all matters reserved except for access. The proposal consists of up to 253 dwellings on what was an allocated site in the local development plan. It currently comprises, it's 2 parcels, so there's going to be 2 separate accesses, which is shown on the layout, this sort of indicative layout plan on page 147, and it's up on the screen in front of us. The main access into the site will be via the roundabout, a new roundabout junction, which is at the point where the Cowbridge Road turns down into Eglwys Brewis, so there'll be a new roundabout there, and that's been subject to extensive negotiations with our highway engineers to make sure they're happy with that access. So that's the only matter that we're considering in full at this stage is that roundabout access detail. So the proposal is for 553 dwellings, as I've alluded to. It's actually quite a low density development when you look at the gross density. Sorry, 253. Sorry, we've been talking for quite some time.
That's a very good capture.
I'm glad you're still awake. Well done.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Very good observation.
It is up to 253 dwellings. Sorry, perhaps I need new glasses. So the site is relatively low density when you look at the gross density, and that's to take account of various constraints on the site, including 2 areas that are being protected for archaeological resource, the sustainable drainage area, and part of the sort of northern part of the site is a C2 flood zone, but that's some way out of the developable area. Again, the key issue here, other than sort of highway impacts and everything else that's set out in the report, and there is objection to the development from the local community, and those are set out at page 151 and 152. But in addition, the key issue I think we'll be having some further debate on is viability. So again, this scheme unfortunately does not stack up in viability terms to enable a full package of Section 106 requirements to be delivered. And if you want to turn your attention to page 177 of the officer's recommendation, that sets out the scope of the Section 106 agreement that officers are recommending members accept. And that is the provision of 17% affordable housing on the site. I should clarify that that is 100% social rented tenure, rather than on other sites we have accepted a split of 70% social rented and 30% low cost home ownership. So that will bring the overall percentage down because social rented is more expensive for a developer to provide than intermediate low-cost home ownership product. That has been driven by the results of our local housing market assessment and input from our housing division, who want to prioritise social rented in this area because of the level of need for social rented tenure. So that's where that comes from. In addition to that, on-site provision of affordable housing, there would be a contribution of £1,980,877 towards education and provision for public open space on the site. In addition, land adjacent to the highway to be reserved for the future adoption and provision of a footway, and off-site highway works which are detailed in the report, which include obviously the access into the site, but other off-site highway works down at the junction at the Jarlston Cross, which is the main access into St Athan. So that's the scope of the planning obligations requirements, which is obviously lower than one might expect on development of this scale. But again, this has been supported by a viability appraisal put forward by the developers that's been robustly assessed by the district valuer, you know, we've reached this position after a lot of consideration of that information and the viability surrounding this development. So I think I'll leave it there for now, Chair.
Thank you, Vicky. We had no one registered to speak against this application, but I will invite Mr. Geraint John, who's speaking in favour, to please take the seat. Once again, sir, when you start talking, you'll have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you in support of this proposal. The application being considered has been the subject of extensive dialogue with your officers. In terms of the principle of development, the application site is of course allocated for housing in the LDP and accordingly is acceptable. This is confirmed by officers as set out within the report. In terms of visual and landscape impact, the application has been the subject of detailed assessment, which concludes that there would be no visual harm from sensitive public vantage points and or features of importance. In terms of highways, there has been considerable and detailed dialogue with your highway officers to arrive at a suitable and agreeable solution in terms of highway design, which will act as a traffic calming measure on approach into the village, slowing traffic, and which also will provide for off-site improvements, not least a combined pedestrian and cycle way along the site frontage to and from the village. In terms of ecology, the application has been supported by a suite of surveys and assessments which confirm the development is acceptable in all respects. 2 rare arable plants have been recorded previously on the site. A mitigation strategy has been agreed with the council in conjunction with NRW, which will involve the transfer of the seed bank onto adjacent land in the applicant's control and ownership, enabling them to be re-established. It's important to note at that point that the seed bank would be lost were the development not to take place, ironically, as a result of changed farming practices. In terms of drainage, flood risk and archaeology, the scheme has been sensitively designed to retain and accommodate these constraints, as confirmed by the illustrative master plan and the consultation responses of the relevant consultees. In terms of scheme viability and deliverability, a viability review undertaken by the district valuer in conjunction with your officers has concluded that the development is viable, albeit subject to reduced planning obligations. The applicant has agreed to a viability review mechanism and, moreover, a restricted time limit for implementation of any planning permission if granted. That will ensure a swift and early delivery and yield of units. Officers have confirmed that the reduced obligations are acceptable in view of the assessed viability and when balanced against the need for housing. So to conclude, the proposed development will, if approved, deliver a high-quality development which is acceptable in all technical respects and which conforms with planning policies as set out in the officer's comprehensive report. I therefore respectfully request that you approve the application as per the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions of clarification? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Thank you much for the introduction there. You referred to cycle paths. I'm just because the plans I have in front of me, I'm afraid, aren't in great deal. If you just explain to us where those are running to and from. Thank you.
Certainly. Effectively, what we've provided in conjunction and in dialogue with officers is to provide a combined shared cycle and footway within the boundary of the site, from its sort of northern reach where it dissipates out to Cowbridge Road towards the rural hinterland, along that frontage to a point where it joins the Annington land, which is effectively the smaller parcel then on the right-hand side of the drawing, or the south-eastern corner. The footway will then, that cycleway will need to pop out then of the confines of the site and run along the roadside frontage. We are hoping, if third-party land allows, to tie the footway in at the, well, I call it the community centre, but effectively it's the Methodist Church. That still dialogue is ongoing because of that third-party interest. If not, the pedestrian crossing point, which will come across the road to the existing shared footway and cycleway on the other side of the road, will just simply be accommodated at an earlier point to get residents and walkers across the road onto the existing footway.
Thank you. Any other questions of clarification? No, thank you very much. You can step down, sir. Anybody like to make any comments? Councillor Cave, did you?
Yes, I just want to say, obviously, you know, it's like deja vu. Here we were, you know, not 10 minutes ago discussing the reduction in affordable housing, and the next item obviously is reduction in affordable housing. I know we decided last time not to go to part 2, but I think in this case it would be a good idea.
So you're moving part 2 later. Okay. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. I'll second that movement to part 2 at a later point, because I think it's absolutely ridiculous we didn't go to one earlier. With regards to some of the other issues that I'd like to raise within this this debate, see, the principle of development on these parcels was part of the local development plan, which I think most people around the table will be aware I didn't particularly support, so that's there. But I'd be interested just to hear sort of an understanding as to the inclusion of this site within the LDP on the basis that there are viability constraints there. I think I'd be interested to hear those, because while we're putting forward sites that have viability constraints, I'm bemused by. A lot of the development around the St Athan area is based on future jobs growth in the area. That was really the premise behind a lot of that discussion. So I'm interested to hear as to sort of how that plays within this development. A little more information on sustainable transport above and beyond the cycle path and that which has been explained to us, especially in the light of there being no announcement regarding a St Athan halt or anything like that as part of the announcement regarding the Metro franchise the other day. So how this area will be served by trains, buses, etc., especially given the pressure upon the bus network. And also just an exact figure on the current waiting lists regarding social housing in the St Athan ward and the area. There's a load of figures in there, but I couldn't pinpoint an exact one while I was just skimming through there. And obviously the housing market assessment is a useful tool, but it's also slightly an awkward tool if we're actually trying to understand future demographic change within this area rather than meeting existing need. I mean, there's obviously an issue when we discussed this with regards to Culverhouse Cross a few years ago, because there was no community, therefore there's no community need. Those things were therefore it was done on an off-site basis. Obviously this is slightly different. We have existing communities in and around, but there's a substantial increase on the communities in the area. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Do you want to cover transport first, or Vicky? Vicky, take it first.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so going back to your question about LDP allocations and viability, it's we could probably debate it for hours, I'm sure, so I'll try and just summarise the points. But we needed to find around 10,000 homes, sites for around 10,000 homes in the local development plan, and that's no easy task. There's a whole range of ways in which you assess sites, and obviously the first thing you do is try to look at sustainable places. You do a sustainable settlement appraisal. You identify those areas that can take that are sustainable and serve their communities in terms of shops, schools, public transport, etc. St Athan was identified as one of those places that can accommodate additional growth because it's already a sustainable settlement. So then you're looking at what available sites there are in the vicinity, in and around the St Athan area, what sites get promoted and so on. And this was obviously amongst a number of sites that have been identified in the St Athan area, and there's actually quite a number of local development plan allocations within the area. In terms of viability appraisals, it is actually it's a very difficult conundrum, and one which the Welsh Government are trying to grapple with at the moment when it comes to the second round of local development plans. We were one of the last in Wales to adopt our development plan, and many of our partners in South East Wales are now in round two. And when you're looking at development sites, you can look at all the information that we have available to us. So flooding constraints and known ecology issues, archaeology issues, and so on and so forth. But viability is not something that we have readily to hand when we're assessing sites for the purpose of a local development plan. So the Welsh Government have talked about introducing additional information requirements on promoters of land to enable us to assess viability issues in a bit more detail when it's at plan preparation stage. That wasn't done as part of this local development plan process on a site-specific basis. It was done on a strategic basis. So our affordable housing policies and our planning obligation policies are based on a strategic assessment of what land values, what development values, what sales values are in the Vale of Glamorgan generally across sort of market housing areas, and that gives you a broad brush approach to, for example, 30% affordable housing in Barry, 35% in places like Roos, Llantwit and St Athan, and 40% in the rural Vale, because generally, you know, that's going to cover off most things. But then what happens at a planning application stage is exactly what's happening on this application and others, where you have to look at the site-specific proposals and whether or not it stacks up in viability terms. And unfortunately, this doesn't meet the full package. And there have been other sites that don't meet it, whilst others do. I would argue it's still appropriate to set the bar high as something to aim for and to work back from there. It does have the unfortunate impact of raising expectations and people feeling like they're missing out and losing out. In other authorities across Wales, the starting point would be zero. The policy starting point would be zero in recognition of the overall lack of viability across their whole area. You know, we've got a much higher bar than that in the first place, but that does lead to disappointment on a site-by-site basis. Sorry, I appreciate that was a little bit of a side issue away from the application, but hopefully that's addressed that issue.
No, Councillor Johnson asked questions about the ODP. Perhaps Mike would like to comment on the questions regarding sustainable transport and the road and cycle path access, I believe.
Yeah, well, obviously my team have assessed the proposals. We're more than happy with the details that have been submitted. The scheme does provide a significant length of shared footway cycleway along the frontage of the property and into the development, and it will join up with existing facilities in the locality. The roundabout junction is to a suitable standard. We're happy with the design, that it meets current standards and will allow suitable access into the development site. And there's no specific issues that we've identified as part of the proposals in terms of highway conditions.
Supplementary?
Yes, I mean, to both, just clarifying, I mean, so under normal circumstances it would be 35% affordable housing in this for St Athan and we got 17. And with Mike, just clarification regarding bus routes, sustainable transport, public transport, not just the bikes / cars.
Thank you. I don't have the bus timetable on me, but obviously this is on a bus route. There are buses that already access bus stops just down the road at the MOD St Athens, so the area is already served by buses. Obviously we have had issues with bus service provision in the rural Vale, but developments such as this and the extensive development that's going to be going on in the area obviously increases the commercial viability of operating public transport services in the area. I have absolutely no knowledge of any expectation of a train service being in the immediate vicinity of this site anytime in the near future. So, it's not been assessed on the basis of it being acceptable if there's a new train service. It's acceptable on the edge of an existing settlement that is sustainable because of the access to existing facilities and services within that settlement. The other issue I think you raised was about the affordable housing waiting list. I don't have the figures to hand, and if members do want information like that, which is not necessarily normal planning evidence, yeah, so sometimes it gets quoted in the housing officer's comments, sometimes it doesn't. There is affordable housing need across the entire Vale. The affordable housing contributions here have been assessed in close liaison with the housing colleagues who were obviously looking at the waiting list, looking at need in the area, and are telling us that the priority needs to be for social rented. But I don't have the waiting list figures to hand, and I would need to be asked for those in advance to have them, I'm afraid.
Next on my list, it was a quick draw. I think Councillor Thomas was just ahead of Councillor King. Councillor Thomas.
Yeah, I actually want to raise a couple of issues that were raised after the meeting this morning, after the site visit this morning by one of the local community councillors who had concerns with this development. There's a decided lack of amenities within the site. The nearest shop is some considerable distance away and along quite hazardous road network. The pavements aren't good yet. There's also, and the actual plans for those pavements aren't there. They are proposed, they are talked about, but that's something to be looked at for the future, we were told this morning. The other thing is the community centre that's marked on the map isn't, as was raised by this gentleman, isn't a community centre. It's actually a Methodist church, which restricts the amount of the nature of some of the usage because of the beliefs of that particular church. I'm also, and I didn't fully understand what he was talking about, but I'm also led to believe that the Flemingston part, which is immediately adjacent, has problems with its mains water access, and whether that can be, whether there's any potential for addressing that within this development, because there's a development sort of that bit closer into St Athan. What's going to be happening around here, and can they be plumbed in too, please?
Vicky?
Thank you. On the issue of water supply and sewerage, obviously I point you to the comments of Welsh Water on page 149, who haven't objected to the proposal, and advising the developer needs to contact them to organise a connection to the sewer system, and that water supply is okay for the development. So I was just coming to that, and so it would be unreasonable of us to resolve existing drainage or water supply issues on an adjoining housing estate. It wouldn't be reasonable to expect this developer to solve those problems. It may be that the development of this site does have that incidental knock-on benefit, but I couldn't confirm that it does. But I would say it is not a matter for you to consider as part of the acceptability of this planning application. The other points that were raised in terms of access to shops and facilities, I had thought that there was a spa shop just on the corner of this, but I couldn't confirm whether or not. There we go. Local members are saying that there is, just on the corner by where the new roundabout proposal is. You have the church, and then obviously you have all the facilities further down into St Athan itself, and Eglwys Brewis and into Llantwit, and I would say that both of those are within cycling distance, certainly, of the application site. You know, part of appraising whether or not LDP sites should be allocated in the first place is an assessment of how accessible those sites are to local facilities, and we would argue that this is such a site.
Councillor King.
Thanks, Chair. As this is only outline permission, I'm thinking ahead and perhaps having more of a discussion with Vicky in an inappropriate forum, but I'm going to risk it anyway. The Lewis-Brewis Road has given us all sorts of difficulties because of the distance from the main high school, and because of the distance from the high school, it didn't warrant paid for bus passes for secondary school pupils. Now, I don't know where this development lies in that catchment distance, but I would just flag up if you could steer your officers to speak with the school's transport colleagues with a view to how this development may or may not exacerbate an already difficult situation, because what we have at the moment is a temporary respite because of the construction of Aston Martin, and my understanding is once that construction is lifted, then we will go back to the same problem, that the catchment area in that vicinity will not warrant paid for places, and we will go back to the problem that we had when I was temporarily responsible for that sort of field. So if you could perhaps get your guys and the school transport people to talk, because it may be something for future considerations. You say there's a fair bit of money. I'm much more concerned about the children who for 5 or 7 years need to traverse that distance.
I would just say that I think those issues are really outside the remit of this committee and the consideration of the planning application.
Councillor Penrose, next on my list.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, coming back on education, just to clarify, in the report, in the summary, it says it's acknowledged that the full education contribution is not viable, instead having agreed with the Director of Learning and Skills. I mean, it's a bit, that's the most you can get. It wasn't that we sort of rushingly said we would discount it by £1 million, which is in fact the difference from the Welsh Government calculations in the earlier part of the report, which is 2.9 million. To 1.9, and this will place obviously more of a burden on education and the Vale of Glamorgan Council, but I think it's, if you like, if we give planning permission, it's a bit of a trade-off there. Answer Councillor King's, yes, transport was facilitated by Viable Services, but we do pay for it via education, and yes, it would in fact increase the number of and cost, because I believe that distance would be outside, so we would be busing more children in there. But as I say, I'm not trying to influence, I was really just putting some clarification from the education point of view.
Thank you, Councillor William. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, it's just to give a bit of extra information on that. I have got an email in front of me which was between our Section 106 officer and the education officers, talking about the reduction in the education contribution. And just to clarify, it followed discussions about how they would utilise that money, and a recognition from the Education Department that actually there was a different way that they could reconfigure St Athan Primary School in order to basically save costs to meet the capacity. So that was what informed the reduction, rather than it being solely about the viability appraisal. It was obviously in light of the viability appraisal, but I wouldn't want members to be under the impression that that cost is entirely passed on to the council as education provider, because they've actually looked at the way in which they could provide it.
The greatest respect it would be passed on. It's just we come out with an alternative scheme, which is a compromise to the scheme that we would do, because if you take a 210 place primary school, costs 3.2 million, we'd have had all about £300,000 to build a brand new school, as opposed to remodelling the existing school. So yeah, it's a play on words, but it's a compromise they've agreed to, so that's fine.
Councillor Williams, next.
Yeah, clearly in the report it does mention about the objections from the local community council, and recognising you've answered some of those, Vicky. I just wondered, what's the consequences? I take it the debate about the development on that side has already been argued through the LDP, so we're not really in a position to disagree with that. Am I right in thinking that? Yeah. Okay. Which brings it down to, I mean, in essence, you've covered all the different areas about sustainability. So some of the aspects, and frustratingly, we've got, there was quite a considerable objection to Northern Access Road to benefit the local community. When that road's actually in place, then it's going to have a cycle route and a walkway, which will reduce the impact of the Eccles Brewers Road. So I know that, although it was objected to, it's going to be beneficial. There will be a small part between Eccles Brewers, which is the other side. This estate's on the other side of Eccles Brewers, but there will be a small part that will still exist, which is still quite dangerous. But that's another issue. I was curious when the public rights-of-way officer just said keep the rights-of-way open, because from the roundabout across the field, there's a direct line for the public right-of-way. I'm just interested how that can be kept open during the development of construction. So that's a question probably I don't know whether you can answer, but
there is a separate process for public right-of-way diversions and things like that. So that would go through that process. But yeah, at some point there's going to be development happening on that path. So what you'd normally expect is when we deal with a reserved matters application, it's unlikely that you're going to have a public right-of-way following the exact path. You usually try and divert it, and you do that in a way that meets good design and that it retains its integrity as a public right-of-way. And then during construction, you just have to manage it to make sure that it remains open and people can still get through.
And I appreciate that. So where the entrance and exit of the public right-of-way, I take it they'll still be at the same points, and there'll be a route in between. Okay, the other aspect which is concern, the existing community surrounding this site utilise the space that's there as an open space. So within this development, you can see it's quite a deduction. So, but that will be available to other members within the local area. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So it would be public open space in the true sense. Whether or not it comes to us for adoption or whether it's maintained by a private management company, it would nevertheless be public open space for the purpose of access. As existing, it's agricultural fields apart from the small parcel. But as I alluded to earlier in the layout, there's actually quite a lot of green space in the layout because of the constraints on the site.
And at risk of falling foul of some people, it'll be open to dog walkers as well.
Anything else? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. So I just wanted to clarify some of the concerns on local residents, etc., on page 152. Really, it's sort of there's two in particular. I just want to just clarify because I'm not sure I understand them. The first one is it's the last bullet point, which is about the desecration of ancient burial grounds. I don't know the area particularly well, so I'm not sure if this is sort of Native American hoodoo or something. I just like a little bit of information of what that's referring to and what, if any, mitigating circumstances are required. And the other is the representation from the Secretary of State for Wales expressing concern about broadband speed and to what extent that is a planning condition or issue in any way, stretch your imagination. Thanks.
We certainly covered the burial grounds on the site visit, and they were clear to see from that. But Vicky?
Thank you. Yes, so on the site plan that's up on the screen now, it's these round areas marked in blue, basically, are the areas that have been protected for the burial grounds, and Glamorgan Gwent Archaeological Trust have been involved in terms of the mitigation to make sure that there is sufficient land sort of reserved, not developed, and with enough of a buffer zone to make sure that the archaeological remains are protected. Sorry, the point about the broadband speed, where did you pick that up from? Did you say it was in page 152?
On 152. From a local member, I can assure you that the broadband speeds there are pretty poor compared to other areas like Barry and Lantern Major. Just, yeah.
I mean, it is a material planning consideration amongst other utilities. You know, having said that, it's not an area with zero coverage, and to a certain extent, it is delivered by the market, and there's a limit to how much we can get involved as a council in terms of improving broadband speeds in the area, amongst all the other things that we do. So, you know, I'm struggling to see how we could really influence broadband speeds to improve the situation through this planning application.
Councillor Hodges.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a short one. We touched on public open space, and also we've got the burial mounds there as well. Within the section on public open space, it breaks down the need, based on the development of houses, of the area for the children's equipped play space. Accept that. Also the other children's play space. I accept that. And then quite a large area for an outdoor sports space. But it goes on to say that there's existing sufficient provision, this is page 173, within the ward for outdoor play space, including the nearby golf course. Now, is that suggested that the kids can go have a kickabout on the golf course? Or,
in the bunker.
Or various other activities? I've had instances in the past where amenity space and open space have been part of a scheme. And I've been referred to my local park a mile and a half away some stages. But so I don't know if the golf course, which I believe is an RAF golf course as well. Is it? Run by them though? Yeah. That's what they says in the publicity. Just wondering how they would view the new little tykes of the area playing on there with their balls, shall I say. Is this a blind?
Just to confirm, outdoor sports provision, which is what you're referring to, doesn't refer just to children's play space. It refers to everybody's play space. For you as well, if you'd like to play golf, so or rugby or anything. But what we do is when we did the local development plan, we did a background paper on open space provision. It assessed all the open space provision in areas into these various categories, and so it does include golf courses, which is an opportunity for recreation, whether or not they're in private ownership. But yeah, but similarly, if it had been a rugby pitch, we would have taken into account the rugby pitch, and that would have only been for rugby players. But you know, nevertheless, the assessment takes in the overall needs of the ward and the overall provision in the ward, and has found that there is surplus there. So that's why it would be unreasonable for us to expect them to provide football pitches or anything else on this site.
I haven't got anyone else on my list to speak, so I will ask for a vote on moving part 2. All those in favour of moving part 2 to discuss the viability on this application? All those against? Any abstentions? That passes, so we're going to move to part 2. I'd ask members in the public gallery to make their way outside. Gareth will guide you out to where you can go. It includes the agents and the applicants as well. Includes, yeah. Don't go too far. Please do come back. We will, having considered whatever's in part 2, we will make the vote under part 1. So the other thing I need to make members aware of is I've been advised by our IT colleagues, gives me a little nod and a wink there, that we cannot guarantee that if we continue to use the microphones that they won't broadcast. So in part 2, if we could speak louder, or indeed we can just gather ourselves closer together if that's going to be an issue. But just to remind people that, and also to anyone at home, that's why we will be going offline. Thank you. And once Gareth comes back and confirms that no one's within earshot, we'll then be able to discuss the issue under part 2. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. I'd like to reopen this planning application in part one. What I'll pass over to Vicky. There's a typo we've noticed in one of the conditions she'd like to draw to your attention. Vicky?
Thank you, Jed. Just to confirm, in condition 2 on page 177, we'll just delete the word either. That's a hangover from where that condition has been amended from the usual standard reserve matters condition. In this case, you'll notice in both condition 2 and 3, it's time limited, is more restrictive than a normal planning consent to reflect the issues that we've been discussing in terms of viability. So there's no either, it's just the development shall begin before the expiration of 2 years from the date of this permission.
Thank you. If no other comments, I'd like to move officer recommendations. Seconded, Councillor Rowlands. All those in favour of this planning application? 7, 8, 9. And all those against? Any abstentions? That passes. Thank you very much. Next meeting will be in 3 weeks' time on the 28th. See you all then.